The letter arrived on a Thursday. One sentence. No farewell. And Judith Aylmer counted the last 5 coins on the table. The pension room in Bedford was cold. Marianne coughed under a thin blanket. 14 years old, thin as a candle. Mrs. Pettifer folded and refolded the shawl over the child, saying nothing. Judith set the coins in a row. Bread, coal, medicine. She could not buy all 3. Then Lady Cecily Wendover's letter came. A post as governess at Thornbury Hall. £60 a year. A warm house. 2 children to teach. Judith read it twice. She smoothed the walnut-brown dress at her knee, touched the mother-of-pearl cameo at her throat, and dipped the pen. She signed the reply, Miss Anne Selby. The ink was still wet when she folded it. The carriage set her down in the snow at Thornbury, 3 weeks later. Mr. Pembridge, the butler, bowed. The Dowager Duchess did not know her. 7 years had thinned the girl she once destroyed. Lady Constance approved the plain gown, the quiet voice, the false name, and turned away. In the long gallery Judith met him. Peregrine Heathcote, Duke of Thornbury. Tall, cold-eyed, a thin scar on the jaw. He hesitated, half a second, in front of a woman he did not remember. Then he walked on. Judith lowered her head and let him pass. But what he would recognize, weeks later, in the curve of a single letter she wrote in his house. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The candle in the Bedford lodging house had burned down to the last inch, and Judith Aylmer measured its life against her own with the same patient arithmetic she had learned to apply to bread, coal, and the price of a physician's visit. The flame guttered whenever the wind pressed against the window frame, and the wind had been pressing against the window frame for 3 nights without pause. She held her needle to the light, drew the thread through the torn cuff of the walnut-brown gown, and made the stitch invisible. Behind her, on the narrow cot beneath the eaves, Marianne coughed. It was not the wet cough of the previous week. It was the dry, ratcheting cough that came in fits of 3, and Judith counted them without lifting her head. 1, 2, 3, then silence. Then the small, exhausted sound of her sister settling back into the bolster. Judith knotted the thread, bit it clean at the base, and set the needle upright in the wooden pincushion that had once belonged to their mother. Only then did she permit herself to turn. Marianne lay with her cheek against the linen, and the linen had been washed too many times to remember what white was. Her hair, the same middle brown as their father's, spread across the pillow in damp waves. A thread of silver at her throat caught the candle, the small cross their aunt had given her at 10 years old, the last object in the room that had any right to catch a light. The girl's eyes were closed, the lashes trembled. She was not asleep. She was pretending, for Judith's sake, and Judith knew it, and Judith would not be the one to break the pretense. "Drink," Judith said instead, and lifted the tin cup from the hearth. Marianne opened her eyes. They were the same gray-green as Judith's own, only larger in the thin face, and they moved to the cup with the docility of a much younger child. She drank in 3 small swallows and gave the cup back. She did not speak. Speech, Dr. Halloway had said in his last visit 2 weeks ago, was to be reserved for necessity. The lungs, he had said with the delicacy of a man who did not intend to return without payment, required rest. The doctor had not returned. Judith set the cup on the hearth beside the kettle. The kettle held 2 inches of water and no more. The coal scuttle held enough for another hour of grudging heat and no more. And the black tin box she had carried out of Aylmer Hall 7 years ago, which now sat on the corner of the deal table under a folded shawl, held precisely 5 coins. She knew, because she had counted them at first light, and again at noon, and once more before opening the seam of the walnut sleeve. Counting had not multiplied them. The door creaked. Judith turned her head. Mrs. Pettifer eased in with the quiet a woman of 62 learns when she has spent 40 years easing in and out of rooms where a sick child sleeps. The nurse's shawl was speckled with wet from the sleet outside. Her round face, netted with the fine creases of a lifetime beneath a lamp, held the composure Judith had long ago recognized as the composure of the very frightened. In one hand she carried the wicker basket, in the other a folded paper. Miss Judith. Was he there? He was there. Mrs. Pettifer set the basket on the boards and did not look at it. He would not come, my lamb. Not without the 2 guineas in his hand. I sent him a letter. He read the letter. Mrs. Pettifer's mouth did what mouths do when they will not let a word through. He said letters do not buy the mercury salt from London. He said, if I might repeat him accurately, that a physician who dies of debt cures no one. Judith folded her hands into her lap, because her hands, at that instant, wished to do something else. Her fingers were long, the joint of the right index stained a permanent black by 7 winters of copyist ink, and she could feel, beneath the walnut sleeve she had just mended, the exact place where the wool had thinned enough to let the cold at her wrist. She kept her hands folded. She looked at the candle. She said, in the ordinary voice she reserved for ordinary difficulty, "Then we shall try Mr. Halloway in Kempston tomorrow." "Kempston is 4 miles, Miss Judith. I know how far Kempston is. And the child cannot be moved. I know that as well." Mrs. Pettifer stood a moment where she was. Then she lifted the folded paper into the candle's circle and set it on the table beside the black tin box, next to the pincushion. It was a good, thick paper, the sort of paper that had been laid down in a shop where paper was reckoned by the ream and not by the sheet. The seal was scarlet. Judith saw the stamp on the wax without touching it, a rearing swan under a coronet. She knew whose seal it was. She had known it the moment Mrs. Pettifer laid the paper down. She did not lift it at once. Marianne coughed twice on the cot. Judith took the letter up. The direction was written in a hand she remembered. Round, forward-leaning, generous with its loops, the hand of a woman who had once shown her, at 15, how to make an M with a flourish. Miss Anne Selby, care of Mrs. Pettifer, No. 4 Cardington Row, Bedford. Beneath that direction, in a smaller hand her old friend Cecily reserved for her afterthoughts, "Deliver at once by any hand that can be trusted." Judith turned the seal to the light and broke the wax with the flat of her thumbnail. The wax gave with a small, dry sound, and the paper unfolded. She read once, she read again. On the second reading her mouth moved slightly at one word. She set the letter face down on the table and looked at the candle for the length of time it took for the flame to steady itself after a draught. "My lamb?" Cecily writes from Thornbury Hall. Mrs. Pettifer's white brows rose no more than 1/4 of an inch. "Lady Cecily Wendover? She is staying there for the winter." Mrs. Pettifer waited. Judith turned the letter face up again. She kept her voice level, as if reading a bill of fare. "The Dowager Duchess of Thornbury requires an English governess for 2 grandchildren, Henry 8, Louisa 6. The former governess has retired to Bath. The position is offered at £60 by the year, with rooms and a maid, and the use of a horse in fair weather. Lady Cecily has written to say she has spoken warmly on my behalf. She asks that I write back within 3 days, under the name I now use. She asks that I come before the 23rd. She was aware, as she spoke, that Mrs. Pettifer's chest had risen and had not yet let itself down. £60, my lamb. Yes. With rooms. Yes. The old woman's face did something Judith rarely saw upon it. It arranged itself, feature by feature, into hope, and then, a heartbeat later, into terror. The terror won. Mrs. Pettifer took 2 steps to the cot and laid the back of her broad, freckled hand against Marianne's cheek. Marianne's eyes flickered open, saw her, closed again. Mrs. Pettifer looked at Judith across the child. "Thornbury." "Yes." "Whose house?" "You know whose house." "I know whose house." Mrs. Pettifer did not raise her voice. She never raised it. "The Duke of Thornbury. Peregrine Heathcote. Who broke your father off at the shoulder 7 years ago? Whose mother wrote us the answer to your letter of retraction, in his hand, and closed the door on you when your father died? That house. That house. My lamb. £60, Nurse Pettifer. He will see you." "He will not see me." "He will see you, my lamb. He saw you at 15. He saw you at 16. He danced with you at the Aylmer harvest. Men remember." Judith set her palm flat upon the letter, as though the letter were a bird that might fly if she took her hand away. She looked into the candle. She said, "Without heat, he remembers Miss Aylmer. He does not remember Miss Anne Selby, and I am, in the eyes of that house, Miss Anne Selby. Cecily has vouched for that name. The Dowager Duchess has never met me. I was 15 at the harvest. He barely spoke to me. He rode the next morning. He was told and he believed that I had signed a letter withdrawing every claim. He has had 7 years to arrange his face. If I have kept mine, I am neither obliged nor entitled to the memory of a man who did not trouble to write to my father when my father was dying." Mrs. Pettifer said, very quietly, it was his mother who wrote. His hand was on the seal. The candle flame steadied. Marianne, on the cot, drew a shallow breath and let it go. Judith opened the black tin box on the corner of the table. She did not need to look inside. Her fingers knew the shape and weight of the shillings by long acquaintance, and she counted them by touch. 5. She closed the lid. She lifted the letter from Cecily, folded it along its old creases, and set it back within the box. She did not lock the box. Locking, at this stage, felt like a superstition she could not afford. She rose. She went to the small writing desk under the window. The desk was the only thing in the room that had any polish left upon it, because Judith had polished it every Sunday for 7 years, and one did not stop polishing a desk because the world had grown thin. She opened the leaf. She uncorked the ink bottle and drew a sheet of paper toward herself. She dipped, wiped, dipped again. She wrote in the hand she had cultivated in her exile, that Cecily and only Cecily knew was hers, an English round hand, upright, plain, without the flourishes of her girlhood. "Madam," she paused. The wind pressed against the window frame, she wrote through it. "I thank your grace for the honor of considering me for the position lately made vacant in Thornbury Hall. It will be my very great pleasure to accept, upon the terms conveyed to me by Lady Cecily Wendover. I shall present myself at Thornbury at the earliest hour of the 23rd of the month, weather permitting." She held the pen a fraction above the page. She dipped once more. Her fingers were steady. "I am, madam, your grace's most obliged and most obedient servant." She did not think. She had been practicing the signature, in idle moments, since Cecily had first suggested the plan by letter 4 months ago. She had written it upon the back of grocers' bills, upon the fly-leaf of Marianne's primer, upon the inside of her own sleeve where the wool had thinned enough for chalk. Anne Selby. 2 words. A capital A with a small forward tilt. A capital S with a particular curve at the shoulder. Her own S, she had discovered, could not quite be unlearned. A Y that tucked its tail into a small closed loop rather than a long one. She wrote it now. Anne Selby. She looked at it. She wrote it a second time upon a scrap, to compare. The 2 signatures matched. She blotted, she folded. She sealed with a plain wafer and no device. On the direction she wrote in a slightly rounder version of the hand. To Her Grace the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, Thornbury Hall, near Bury St. Edmunds, by favor of Lady Cecily Wendover. She set the letter beside the tin box. Then she sat very still, both hands upon the desk, and waited until her chest no longer required attention. "Nurse Pettifer, my lamb, you will remain here with her." "I will remain. I will send the doctor from Kempston at the end of the first week. I will send £4 by the coach on the first Monday of every month, from the day I arrive. I will send more when I can. The rent will be paid on the 15th to Mrs. Coatsworth by draft on Lady Cecily's man of business in Cambridge. She has arranged it in the letter. You need not go to her. And you, Miss Judith? I shall do what I have already done for 7 years. I shall be Miss Anne Selby. I shall teach 2 children their letters and their globes and their needle. I shall be civil to the Dowager Duchess. I shall keep out of the corridors that have no business with me. I shall be sensible." Mrs. Pettifer looked at her. There was, in the old blue eyes, a film that Judith had learned to name in silence and never aloud. The cataract that had been thickening for 18 months, and that no country doctor between here and Cambridge had suggested touching. Mrs. Pettifer had not asked to have it touched. Mrs. Pettifer had eyes enough left, she said, to know a fever from a fret and to boil water without spilling it, and that was as much sight as a woman of 62 required. She looked at Judith now and did not, this time, argue. "He will know you, my lamb. He will not. He may, but he has no cause to name me. If he names me, I shall answer for it then and not before. If he does not, I shall pretend he could not have named me if he tried. That is all." Mrs. Pettifer bowed her head. "Then we are agreed." "We are agreed." Marianne, on the cot, spoke without opening her eyes. Her voice, when she used it, was reedy, a 15-year-old note reduced to 14 by fever and to 12 by the effort of speaking at all. "Judith." "Yes." "Is it his house?" Judith set the pen down. She rose from the desk. went to the cot, and knelt beside it with the ease of a woman half her age. She took Marianne's hand and put it between her own. Marianne's fingers were hot. The birthmark on the girl's left wrist, a small crescent the color of tea, showed itself against the cuff of her nightgown. Yes. Is he there? He is there. Will you hate him? I shall not have leisure to hate him. I shall be a governess. Marianne's mouth curved a very little. She kept her eyes closed. Judith, if you meet him. I shall meet him. It is a small house for a duke's house. I shall meet him. Do not curtsy too low. I shall curtsy exactly as low as a governess is required. That is too low. The corner of Judith's mouth answered without her permission. She lifted Marianne's hand and set it back beside the girl on the linen. Sleep. I am sleeping. Sleep, truly. I am sleeping truly. Judith remained kneeling until the breathing beside her lengthened, and then a little longer. When she rose, her knees creaked, though she was 23. The room was that cold. She went back to the desk. She took the sealed letter to Thornbury and stood a moment with it in her hand. She was aware of the shape of the room around her, as she had never quite let herself be aware of it before. The narrow bed, the deal table, the 2 chairs, one whole and one mended, the black kettle, the shawl folded upon the corner of the table where it hid what remained of Aylmer Hall, reduced to 5 coins. A cheap print of Bedford Bridge nailed above the mantel by some previous tenant. The window that would not shut. The candle that had less than an inch to give. 7 years in this room, or rooms very like it. Cambridge first, then Ely, then Norwich when the Cambridge school shut, then here in Bedford when Norwich turned out to be more expensive than she had been advised. 7 years of copying letters at 3d a page for 2 attorneys who did not inquire whether she was a lady or a laundress, and did not, in candor, care. 7 years of teaching the daughters of a butcher and a corn factor to spell and to sit still. 7 years of writing to Cecily Wendover under a name that was not her own, because the name that was her own was the surname of a scandal in 3 counties, and to write it above a direction was to invite refusal upon whatever she had asked. 7 years of the walnut-brown gown, cut down twice, taken in 3 times, mended in 14 places she could count, and in 20 she could not. She set the letter to Thornbury upon the mantel-shelf, where Mrs. Pettifer would see it in the morning, and give it to the mail coach at the White Horse. She turned back to the room. She stood at its center and looked at nothing. Then she went to the small chest at the foot of her own bed and lifted the lid. Under a folded sheet, under a linen shift with lace at the throat that she had not worn since she was 18, at the very bottom, wrapped in a scrap of dark silk, lay the mother-of-pearl cameo. She lifted it into the candlelight. It was small. It had been her mother's. It had been given to her mother by her grandmother upon the birth of Judith herself, and the reverse of it, if one turned it over, showed the initials E.A. in fine engraving for Elizabeth Aylmer. On the face, in mother-of-pearl no thicker than a thumbnail, a woman in profile in the antique manner. Not a distinguished face, only a peaceful one, the sort of face a grandmother would think to have set into a brooch upon the occasion of a granddaughter's arrival. The setting was plain silver, worn at the edge where a thumb had lived. It was the only object out of Aylmer Hall that Judith had refused to sell. At any of the 3 moments she had been offered a good price for it. She held it a moment in the palm of her hand. Then she pinned it at the throat of the walnut-brown gown, over the mended cuff, where she would wear it upon the coach and into Thornbury Hall as Miss Anne Selby, because whatever else she was made to leave at the door of that house, the cameo would enter it with her, and it would enter it as her own. She stood before the small mirror on the wall. The glass was flawed. A diagonal line ran through it from corner to corner and cut her face at the temple. She let it cut her face. She looked at what the flaw allowed her to see. The oval face, the high cheekbones sharpened by 3 months of thin meat, the straight dark brows, the gray-green eyes she had inherited from a mother she barely remembered and had given, in miniature, to a sister who slept 8 feet behind her. She tried a curtsy in the glass, modest, low enough, not too low. She spoke aloud, in the round, plain voice she had spent 7 years teaching her tongue. Anne Selby, if it please your grace. The voice sounded exactly as it had sounded in Cambridge and in Ely and in Norwich, and it would sound exactly so upon the terrace at Thornbury Hall. She turned from the glass. The candle flame at last went out. She had known it would. She had allowed it its full inch. She stood a moment in the dark that followed and let her eyes learn it. Then she found the tinderbox by touch, struck for the small stub she kept for emergencies, and lit that. The stub would give her 20 minutes. She did not require 20 minutes. She required 5. She sat again at the desk. She drew toward her a second sheet, smaller, and dipped again. Dearest C, I accept. Do not tell her my name. Do not tell her anything of me but what you have already told. I shall come as A.S. and remain as A.S. Do not smile at me when the door opens. You have too pretty a smile to spare it. Do not say my sister's name. I shall speak of a sister at Bedford who is unwell, and no more. If he asks you anything of me by any name, tell him what you would tell a stranger. He has forfeited the rest. She paused. If a Boscawen should appear at that house, on any errand, be so good as to write me at once. I have a reason. Yours, in the practice of names, A. She sealed this with the wafer also. She wrote Cecily's direction in the same round hand. She set the second letter upon the mantel beside the first. The little stub burned. Somewhere in Cardington Row a dog whined and was quieted. Marianne slept. Mrs. Pettifer, who had settled into the mended chair with her knitting, let her hands rest at last upon the wool in her lap. The click of her needles slowed and stopped, as it did in these hours, without her strictly consenting to it. Judith did not disturb her. She took up her needle again and turned the mended sleeve. There was a second small tear near the shoulder seam she had not yet reached. She threaded, drew, and stitched. Her breath made a small cloud that reached and dissolved, and did not reach as far as the candle. She thought, as her hand moved, of the house she had entered once at 15 and once at 16, the white front, the double stair, the gallery of Heathcotes going back to a tutor with a beard, Peregrine Heathcote at 23, then Marquis of Kelsey, with a fine scar new at the corner of his jaw, dancing at the Aylmer harvest because his mother had made him promise to ride over and be civil to a neighbor whose wife had known hers as a girl. Judith at 15 in a white muslin over a pink slip, her hair in a plait around her head like a wreath, her mother 3 months in the ground, and her father, for the first time since it, laughing at the fiddle. Peregrine had bowed at the beginning of the country dance and had said, with the seriousness that was his form of courtesy, Miss Aylmer, I hope the summer has been kind to you. She had answered that it had. She had lied. She had been 15. He had written her a note at the end of that visit. A single line, in a neat, forward-leaning hand, upon plain paper, without seal. She had kept it. She had it still, folded within the leaves of a small prayer book beneath the linen shift, beneath the cameo in the chest at the foot of her bed. She would not take the note with her to Thornbury Hall. She would leave it in Bedford where it belonged. She would enter that house as if she had never received it. If a Boscawen should appear. She had written the sentence and could not, now, entirely account for having written it. Mr. Oswin Boscawen, solicitor of Lincoln's Inn, had been her father's man, had been her father's man before her father was her father, had drawn up the settlement upon her father's marriage, and drawn up the will, and read out its clauses at Aylmer Hall the January she was 16. She had not seen him since, though he had written to her twice, at Ely and at Cambridge. Upon business she had answered from a distance and by a false hand. She did not know why she had thought of him tonight. She knew only that some part of her mind, without her permission, had begun to lay out pieces upon a board, and Mr. Boscawen was a piece she wished to keep in view. She stitched. She finished the second tier. She turned the sleeve and set the gown aside. The stub was down to half. She took the sealed letter to Thornbury and, after a moment, the sealed letter to Cecily, and set both together in her reticule upon the peg by the door, where she would carry them out with her in the morning to the White Horse Yard. Then she put her hands to her hair and, without a glass, unpinned the plain bands from around her head and let them fall along her shoulders. The single long braid that circled her crown loosened when she drew out the pin. She combed it through with her fingers 3 times, plaited it again, tied it, and pinned it in tomorrow's shape. Bandeau, plain, low, with the single plait around. The hair of a governess, not a girl and not a lady. She went to the cot at last and drew the coverlet a finger's breadth higher on Marianne's shoulder. She held her hand a moment over the crown of her sister's head, not touching, because touch would wake her, only holding a warmth above her that was not warm enough to matter, and mattered because it was hers. 23rd, she said, so quietly it did not carry. Marianne's breath moved. Judith turned. She blew out the little stub. The dark closed in around her as the room instructed it to. Somewhere in Bedford a clock struck the third quarter. Not St. Paul's, which she knew, but the shabbier, smaller bell of St. Cuthbert's beyond the corn market. She counted the strokes to keep her ears occupied. She lay down at last in her own narrow bed in her stays and her walnut-brown gown, because the cold was too near the bone tonight for undressing. She folded her hands upon her chest above the mother-of-pearl cameo she had not yet unpinned. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Not for a long time. She lay in the dark and turned upon the ceiling above her, plank by plank, the plan of the coach roads between Bedford and Bury St. Edmunds, the price of the outside seat versus the inside, the hour at which the White Horse coach left, the inn at Cambridge where she would take her tea and rest Marianne's small trunk of gifts, the letter to the doctor at Kempston she must write in the morning before setting out, the direction to Lady Cecily she had already sealed, the direction to the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury she had already sealed, and under all of it, laid down like a floor beneath a house, the 2 words she would write in the morning at the White Horse in the ostler's book for the passenger's name, and in the fortnight following, at the servants' hall book in Thornbury Hall, and in the housekeeper's ledger, and in whatever great morocco-bound register the Duke of Thornbury kept, at his mother's insistence, for guests and dependents. Anne Selby, Anne Selby, Anne Selby, a capital A with a small forward tilt, a capital S with a curve at the shoulder she had not been able, in 7 years, to persuade to lie flat, a Y that tucked its tail into a small closed loop. She had written those 2 words 1,000 times. She would write them 1,000 times more. The wind pressed against the window frame. The kettle made no sound. Marianne coughed once, small, and did not cough again. Mrs. Pettifer, in the chair, breathed the long, even breath of a woman who has decided to keep watch and has been overtaken. Somewhere far off, the coachman at the White Horse Yard called to his ostler across the paved court in the tone men use before dawn. Judith opened her eyes upon the ceiling. She said nothing. She had no need to speak. She had, at last, a decision made. On the 23rd of the month, in the year of our Lord 1817, at 4:30 in the afternoon by the clock of St. Cuthbert's, Miss Anne Selby would present herself at the servants' entrance of Thornbury Hall, in a walnut-brown gown, with a mother-of-pearl cameo at her throat, and a signature ready at her fingertips that she had polished as some women polish silver, for a use she had not, until this night, permitted herself to name. She closed her eyes again. The wind pressed. Marianne slept. The house of Aylmer, in the small dark room above Cardington Row, had 5 coins upon its table, and a name at its door that was not its own, and its last daughter, 23 years old, and not yet defeated, had accepted an offer of £60 a year to teach 2 children their letters in the house of the man who had, without ever intending it, undone her family. She would write his mother's book in her own borrowed hand, and she would keep it until the day the hand was known. The coach struck a rut 2 miles short of the gate, and Judith caught the strap with the ink-stained finger before her forehead met the panel. The other passenger, a curate bound for Bury, snored on through the jolt. Outside, the snow had thickened into a steady white curtain, and the horses labored through drifts that came halfway up their fetlocks. Judith pressed her cheek to the cold window and counted turns of the wheel against the count of her own breath. She had left Bedford at the first grey of the 23rd and travelled through Cambridge without stepping down. The Cambridge stop had eaten 1 shilling for bread and small beer. The Bury coach had cost 7. She had 4 shillings and 3 left in the tin box now, sewn into the inside pocket of the reticule against her ribs, and a rolled parcel of clean linen at her feet, and the ivory paper of Cecily's letter folded flat inside her glove. At the crest of a low hill the coach slowed, and the guard called down from the box that they were within sight of the house. Judith wiped a clear circle in the fogged glass. Thornbury Hall stood at the end of a long avenue of lime trees, the trees bare and black against the white ground. The house itself was a long grey shape with 3 tiers of windows and a portico of 6 columns, all softened by snow. Smoke rose in 2 thin lines from the north wing. Somewhere behind the roof a rookery cawed. It looked, she thought, exactly like the drawing on the wine-stained calendar Mrs. Pettifer had once brought back from a Yarmouth fair. She did not let the thought settle. She unfolded the letter, refolded it, and put it back inside the glove. She had one duty at this door, and only one: to be Anne Selby. and to have never been anyone else. The coach set her down at a small gatehouse a quarter-mile from the main entrance, where a boy in a green livery, with mittens too large for him, took her name. "Miss Selby," she said, "for Her Grace the Dowager Duchess." The boy nodded once and rang a bell inside the gatehouse. A dog cart came down the drive within 10 minutes, driven by a groom with a scarf tied under his hat. He touched the brim, put her small trunk between his boots, and turned the horse without a word. The drive to the servants' entrance took another 12 minutes at a walk, because the snow was above the axle in places, and because the groom did not seem inclined to hurry. Judith used the 12 minutes to sit very still and to say, silently and in order, the 3 things she had promised herself in Bedford. She would not laugh at any joke made about the Aylmers. She would not speak of Norfolk. She would not, under any temptation, look for too long at any face in a portrait frame. The servants' entrance faced east, into a courtyard swept clear of snow by 2 men with wide brooms. A stone arch bore the Thornbury acorn carved above the keystone. The groom lifted her trunk down, tipped his hat, and vanished with the horse into a passage under the arch. The door opened before she reached it. Mr. Horton Pembridge stood on the step, hatless, his white hair cut close against the cold, his coat unfastened at the throat, as though he had come from somewhere warmer, without stopping to button it. He was taller than she had expected, and his face, though set, was not stern. He inclined his head the smallest possible amount. "Miss Selby. Mr. Pembridge, I believe. You are exactly to the minute. Her Grace commends punctuality." She had reached the door as the far bell of some parish tower had begun to strike 4, and it was striking still, 4 small metallic notes crossing the courtyard. "That is St. Cuthbert's," he said. "It is fast by a half-minute in winter. Please come in." She followed him into a stone passage that smelled of beeswax and coal. A servant took her trunk. Another took her cloak, which was heavy with wet snow along the hem, and hung it on a peg where no one would tread on it. Pembridge moved without hurry through 3 corridors and a small stair, and Judith kept 2 paces behind him and looked at nothing but his heels. At a plain oak door, he paused. "You will wait in the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Farthing is at Bury today for the marketing. Tea will be brought. Her Grace will send for you when she has seen the parish accounts." "Thank you. Miss Selby." She turned her head. Her Grace does not care for hesitation in an answer, nor for a voice raised above a fire. "I shall not raise mine." He looked at her a moment longer than the courtesy required. Then he opened the door and left her. The housekeeper's room was low, warm, and cleanly kept, with a fire behind a copper guard and a round table covered in green baize. A silver kettle sat on a trivet at the hob. A tabby cat slept in the seat of the only comfortable chair. Judith did not sit. She stood at the table, took off her gloves, and pushed the ink-stained finger against the underside of her chin until the mark of it did not show. A maid of about 16 came in with a tray. She set down tea, a plate of thin bread and butter, and a small dish of preserved damsons, then curtsied and shut the door with both hands. Judith took the tea, held the cup a moment for the heat, and put it back untasted. She had not, she realized now, eaten since Cambridge, but if Her Grace sent for her while she chewed, she would arrive with her jaw working, and Her Grace, she had been told already, did not care for that either. She drank 3 swallows of the tea. She ate half a slice of the bread. She sat then, at last, on the edge of a plain chair, and folded her hands in her lap in the exact position they had held at 15, when her mother had taught her the walnut piano. An hour passed. The tea grew cold. The cat slept. Somewhere above her, boots crossed a bare floor, once, twice, and then quiet. At 5:30, Pembridge returned. "Her Grace will see you now. This way, if you please." He led her up a servant's stair and out into a broad first-floor corridor, lit by tall wall sconces already burning against the winter dusk. The floor was of dark oak polished to a mirror. A runner of Turkey work in blood and cream ran down the middle. Portraits hung on the north wall in a solemn line. Heavy men in armor, ladies in ruff and lace, 3 young officers in scarlet, and Judith kept her gaze at the runner and did not lift it once. At the end of the corridor, a set of double doors stood ajar. Pembridge opened them. "Miss Selby, Your Grace." Lady Constance Heathcote, Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, sat in an oval room upholstered entirely in pale green watered silk. A small fire burned to her left. On a table at her right lay a household ledger, an inkstand, and a folded pair of spectacles. She wore a gown of lavender fumo silk under a lace cap the color of new bone. A tortoiseshell comb held her hair. Her hands, resting one upon the other, were small and very still. Judith crossed the 7 paces from door to carpet and made a curtsy. She held it exactly the length she had rehearsed in Bedford. When she rose, she kept her eyes lowered to the hem of her Grace's gown. Miss Selby. Your Grace. You are from Norfolk, I understand. From near Norwich, Your Grace. My people were in trade. Trade of what sort? Wool, Your Grace. My father kept books for a merchant on Elm Hill. And he is now? Buried, Your Grace, these 6 years. Your mother? Buried also. How pitiable. Have you brothers? None living. Sisters. Judith allowed the smallest pause, of a length no gentlewoman could have named as hesitation. None, Your Grace. She waited for the room to strike her for it. The room did not. The dowager only turned a page of the ledger with a fingertip that had been schooled for 40 years not to hurry. Lady Wendover speaks warmly of your steadiness. She writes that you have a plain hand and a clear French accent, and that you do not lean on the piano when it is out of tune. Her ladyship is kind. Her ladyship is generous, which is a different thing. Lift your chin, Miss Selby. I should like to see you. Judith lifted her chin. Lady Constance looked at her. The blue-gray eyes moved without hurry over the forehead, the mouth, the line of the jaw, and paused, for perhaps half a beat, on the camafeu at her throat. The pause was long enough for Judith to hear her own pulse, and short enough that she could not swear it had happened. You are handsome, said the dowager, for the position. Not so much that Henry will remark on it in 3 years. That is well. Turn your head to the fire. Judith turned. Again to me. She turned. The dowager closed the ledger. I keep a governess who understands her place. My grandchildren are in this house because their mother is dead, and their father, my son-in-law, is a fool who took to Neapolitan air for his lungs. Henry is 8 and reads Latin badly. Louisa is 6 and will not eat crusts. You will speak to them in English before breakfast, in French after breakfast, and you will not use a rod. If they misbehave, you will send them to me. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace. You will not walk in the South Drive after dusk. You will not enter the library when the Duke is at his books, which is between 9 and 11 every evening. You will not receive letters at this house that you have not shown to Mrs. Farthing. You will not, on any account, seek to be presented to my guests. If any guest addresses you, you will answer briefly and withdraw. Yes, Your Grace. £60 a year, paid quarterly. Board, a maid to share with Louisa's nurse. Use of a horse on Sundays if the weather permits. One afternoon a fortnight to yourself. Your Grace is generous. Your Grace is careful. I have known governesses to make themselves at home in a house. That is a fault I do not indulge. Are you a woman who makes herself at home, Miss Selby? I am a woman who keeps her rooms tidy. The dowager looked at her again, and this time the corner of her mouth moved perhaps a 32nd of an inch. You have wit. Use it in the schoolroom. Yes, Your Grace. You are engaged. Pembridge will show you your room and the schoolroom. The children are at their supper. You will meet them tomorrow at 9, that is all. Judith curtsied. She was 2 paces from the door when the dowager spoke again, without lifting her head from the ledger. Miss Selby. Your Grace. That brooch is a very pretty thing. Was it your mother's? The camafeu weighed 1/4 of an ounce. Under the dowager's question, it weighed a great deal more. Yes, Your Grace. Keep it inside the collar in the schoolroom. Chalk-marked silver. Yes, Your Grace. She curtsied a second time and passed through the door where Pembridge was waiting. He closed it behind her with the softness of a man who had closed a great many doors on great many young women in his life, and knew the exact weight the door would take without offense. They walked back along the runner in silence. At the head of the servants' stair, he paused. Your room is up 2 floors and at the west end. I shall show you the schoolroom on the way. Have you dined? I ate at Cambridge. Then you have not dined. A tray will be sent. Thank you. He did not answer. He turned instead and led her past the double doors, past a smaller door of green baize that must have been the schoolroom, and around the elbow of a corridor into a section of the house she had not yet seen. Here the light dropped away from the sconces of the staterooms and came only from a lamp at the far end. Portraits gave way to painted panels of hunting scenes. The runner ran on. Judith kept her eyes on the runner. She did not, therefore, see the party of 3 come around the far corner until she heard the smaller sounds of them. A child's laugh caught quickly behind a hand, a man's boot on the polished floor, the tap of a small dog's nails. Pembridge stopped, took 1 step to the side of the runner, and stood very straight against the wall. Judith did the same. The party came on. A little girl in a white pinafore ran first, holding a rag rabbit under one arm. She saw Judith, saw Pembridge, remembered a lesson, and slowed to a fast walk with her chin in the air. A boy of about 8 followed at a proper pace, his hands behind his back like a small statesman, his eyes bright with a joke he had not been allowed to finish. Behind them came a spaniel who took no notice of anyone. Behind the spaniel walked the Duke. He wore a black coat of bath cloth, a smoke-gray waistcoat, a plain white cravat. His hair was short and dark and carried, in the light of the corridor lamp, a single strand of gray at the right temple. On the little finger of his left hand, a gold signet, with the Thornbury acorn, caught the lamp once and let it go. His face was set in the neutral expression of a man walking his own house at his own pace, and it was, Judith thought in the half-breath she permitted herself, the same face she had seen at 15 across a Norfolk barn floor, only made colder by 7 years, and by the small white scar of 3 centimeters along the left side of the jaw. He came level with Pembridge and inclined his head. "Pembridge, Your Grace." His eyes moved from the butler to the woman standing beside him. Judith kept her head bowed. She saw only the toe of his boot on the runner, and the hem of the little girl's pinafore behind him, and the tail of the spaniel disappearing round the child's ankle. She did not lift her chin. He stopped. It was, in the reckoning of a corridor and a servant's timing, half a second. It was, in the reckoning of Judith Aylmer, the length of a breath she could not draw and did not draw. His boot did not move. The little girl, 4 paces on, looked back over her shoulder in surprise. The spaniel sat, then thought better of it, and stood. Then the Duke walked on. He did not speak. He did not turn his head. His boot cleared the edge of the runner, and the boy behind him made a small inquiring sound, and was hushed by the girl. And the party of 3, and the spaniel passed out of the corridor, and around the elbow at the far end. Pembridge did not move for another full breath. Then he stepped back onto the runner and took up his lamp. "This way, Miss Selby." Judith followed. They walked the length of the corridor without speaking. At the door of the schoolroom, Pembridge opened it, showed her the 2 small desks, the map of Europe pinned above the fire, the shelf of primers, the pair of empty inkwells set out for the morning. He did not remark on what had happened in the corridor. She did not remark on it either. When he asked whether she wished her tray in the schoolroom or in her own room, she said her own room, please, and thank you. He took her up 2 more flights, along a narrower passage where the runner ended at last and the floorboards were bare and pale, and stopped at a door of plain deal painted white. "Miss Selby's room." "Thank you. There is a bolt on the inside. Use it. Her Grace does not care for wandering." "Yes. Good evening." He went. She stood a moment on the threshold, listening for his tread to reach the bottom of the stair, and then she closed the door and slid the bolt. The room was small and clean. An iron bed under a white counterpane, a plain washstand with a blue jug, a chair, a fire not yet lit, a tallow candle on the chimney-piece with a tinderbox beside it, 1 window under a low eave, a single hook on the back of the door for her cloak. Her trunk had been set at the foot of the bed. Someone, the maid with the tray perhaps, or a footman, had laid a folded blanket at the pillow. Judith struck the tinder, lit the candle, and knelt at her trunk. She took out, in order, the second linen shift, the black round jacket for the schoolroom, the ribbon of narrow blue for Louisa, she had bought it in Cambridge on the shilling, the 2 primers she had copied out herself, the packet of nibs, the small round pot of ink stopped with wax. She set each thing on the counterpane. She did not, at any point, take the camafeu from her throat. She sat on the edge of the bed. The candle burned. The chimney drew badly and coughed a small breath of smoke onto her sleeve. He had stopped. She turned the thought as one turns a stone in the palm to feel it dry on one side and wet on the other. He had stopped, and he had walked on, and he had not spoken. If he had known her, truly known her, across the years and the changed light, he would not have walked on. He was Peregrine Heathcote, Duke of Thornbury, in the corridor of his own house. He owed no explanation to any woman standing against a wall. He would have spoken, and he had not spoken, and therefore he had not known her, and therefore she was safe. And yet the boot had paused. She stood up. She smoothed the walnut brown at the waist. She refolded the ribbon of narrow blue. She put the primers side by side, tallest first, and laid the pot of ink beside them, and set the packet of nibs at right angles to the pot. The tray came. It carried a slice of cold mutton, a piece of soft cheese, 3 roasted potatoes, an apple, and a small pot of tea. The maid, the same girl of the housekeeper's room, set it down on the washstand, curtsied, and shut the door. Judith ate everything on the tray. She had not, she discovered by the eating, been aware how hungry she was. She saved the apple for the morning. Below the eave the wind rose. Snow blew against the small window and slid down it in a soft, irregular line. The bell of St. Cuthbert's struck 7. She took the letter of Lady Cecily from her glove, unfolded it a final time, and read it through. Cecily had written in the sloping hand Judith remembered from the Wendover schoolroom, all the G's like fishhooks. In the last line she had said, "I shall not be at Thornbury when you arrive. I come the 2nd week of December for the little party. Say nothing of me till then, and nothing of anyone at all." Judith folded the letter, took a taper from the chimney-piece, and touched it to the candle. She burned the letter over the empty grate, and pushed the black flake with her toe onto the hearthstone. Then she sat at the chair by the washstand and opened the primer she had copied for Louisa. She had written the words on ruled paper in her plainest round hand. On the first page she had written the child's name across the top, Louisa. She looked at the letters a long time. The L was straight, the O was round, the U had a small dip in its ending that she had not, in 7 years, learned to teach out of her hand. At 8 o'clock she took a fresh sheet of foolscap from the packet and wrote a short letter to Mrs. Pettifer at Cardington Row. She wrote that the journey had been long but the coach had been kind. She wrote that her grace was severe but not cruel. She wrote that she had a room of her own, and a fire that would be lit tomorrow, and a bolt on her door. She did not write the words, the Duke. She did not write the word, Peregrine. She wrote that she loved Marianne and would send £4 by the coach on the first Monday, as she had promised. She signed the letter, "Your affectionate A.S., and blotted it, and folded it, and sealed it with a plain drop of tallow because she had no wax. She would give it to Pembridge in the morning, or to the maid, whichever came first. She undressed then, folding the walnut brown over the chair and hanging the small black jacket on the hook beside it. She took off the camafeu and laid it, initiais to the ceiling, in the middle of the washstand shelf where she would see it as soon as she opened her eyes. She said no prayer. In 7 years she had not learned a prayer she could still bear to say, and she was too tired tonight to invent one. She climbed into the iron bed. The sheets were coarse and cold. The blanket at the pillow smelled of lavender bags. Somewhere in the great house below her, a clock chimed once for the quarter hour. The wind pulled at the chimney. The candle guttered. Just before she blew it out, she thought, without meaning to and without the least defense against it, of the boot on the runner. The boot had stopped. That was the fact. She blew out the candle. 2 floors below, and half a wing away, in a book-lined room whose door had been closed since Pembridge's return, Peregrine Heathcote sat at a mahogany table. A folio of estate accounts lay open before him. His pen rested untouched on the inkstand. His left hand, with the signet ring loose upon it, lay flat upon the folio in a manner that suggested it had lain that way for some time. He was thinking, with the particular slow attention he had given to almost nothing else for 7 winters, of the way a woman had held her head at his passing. The tilt of it had been, for a fraction of a second before she remembered herself, higher than a governess had any business to hold. He had noticed the tilt in the same instant she had corrected it. He had noticed also, though he could not have said why he noticed it, a small black smudge on the underside of a chin that had been very close to lifting into the lamplight. Ink-stained thumb and finger. A schoolmistress might carry ink for years. It was nothing. Half the household went about with a mark of something upon a hand. He had walked on because to stop was to speak, and to speak in a corridor to a woman he had never been introduced to was a thing his mother would in due course be told of, and would in due course make into a small, unforgivable weather front. He had walked on because he did not know her, and one did not stop for people one did not know. He shifted the signet on his finger a quarter turn. On the folio, the ink of some tenant's arrears was drying without him. Miss Selby, Pembridge had said in the passage. Miss Anne Selby. From Norwich. Cecily Wendover's recommendation. There had been an Anne Selby, he thought, at some parson's house in Suffolk 2 years ago. A pale girl who had married the curate. Not this one. This one had a shape at the throat under the camouflage that this one, evidently, had not. He picked up the pen at last and dipped it. He wrote a figure in the margin of the tenant's page and blotted it. He wrote a second figure. On the third he stopped, and looked instead at the empty space at the head of the sheet, where the clerk had ruled a line for the date and where he had, for 2 nights now, been putting off the writing of the 23rd of December. He put down the pen. He rose, crossed the room, and stopped at the small locked cabinet set into the paneling to the right of the fire. He did not open it. He set his palm flat against the door of it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he took his hand away, went back to the table and sat down, and this time he wrote the date at the head of the page with a hand that was, when he looked at it, perfectly steady. Above him, at the west end of the 3rd floor, in an iron bed under a low eave, Judith Aylmer was already asleep. She was dreaming, though she would not remember it in the morning, of a barn floor in Norfolk in autumn, and of a hand offered to hers for a country dance, and of a billets of 1 line she had left, deliberately, in a small book of prayers in Bedford. Snow moved against her window. In the corridor 2 floors below, a clock struck the half, and a mile off, unseen and untold as yet in this house, a small dog-cart bearing the initials O.B., carved discreetly into its wooden footboard, was setting out from an inn near Cambridge, its lantern trimmed against the weather, its driver already muffled to the eyes. Mr. Oswin Boscawen was coming north. The bell of St. Cuthbert's had already struck 7 when Judith knelt on the schoolroom floor and coaxed the fire back into life. Snow lay along the sill in a clean white bar. Louisa sat cross-legged on the hearthrug with the rag rabbit in her lap and a slate balanced on her knees. Henry stood at the window with his hands behind his back, imitating a posture he had seen somewhere and had not yet earned. Miss Selby, Louisa said, without looking up, the rabbit has not learnt his letters. Then we shall teach him together, Judith answered. She rose, dusted her palms against the walnut-brown skirt, and set the primer on the small deal table. Henry turned from the window. Nurse said governesses do not stay past 12th night. Nurse said many things last winter that did not come true. Judith drew out a chair for him, and when he hesitated, drew it out again with the same steadiness. He sat. She had risen in the dark to copy the day's page. She had rebuilt the fire twice. She had swallowed a thin cup of tea in the housekeeper's room, while Mrs. Farthing, returned from Bury the night before, watched her over the rim of her own cup and said nothing that could be quoted afterwards. All of that lay behind her by the time the children came in. Now she opened the primer to the first plain page. L, she said, for Louisa, for lantern, for lilac in June. Louisa traced the letter with a small ink-stained finger. The dip in the U had been Judith's fear at midnight. In daylight, it looked like nothing at all. She let the child copy the line 3 times and did not correct her once. Miss Selby, said Henry, whose eyes had been on her hand, your finger is stained. So it is. Papa's steward has a finger like that. He writes letters all day. Then he and I are of one trade. She did not smile with her mouth. Something behind her eyes softened all the same. Henry, who was 8 and watched everything, noted it and put his own hand upon the paper without further comment. At 9, the primer was closed and the French reader taken down. She read a page of La Fontaine aloud with a Norfolk quiet that carried the vowels without displaying them. Louisa yawned into the rabbit's ear. Henry corrected her pronunciation of Renard and looked pleased with himself, and Judith let him, because a boy of 8 who has just corrected his governess will remember the lesson longer than any praised one. At 10:30, the door opened without a knock. Mrs. Farthing entered with a basket of clean linen on her hip and her eyes running over the room like water finding a level. Her Grace bids the children to her before their walk. Miss Selby will take them at 11, by the small stair. Yes, Mrs. Farthing. Not the great stair. No. The housekeeper's gaze paused on the primer, on the fire, on the walnut-brown sleeve. It traveled once to the throat, where the cameo lay hidden inside the linen collar, as Lady Constance had commanded, and traveled back again. "The tea in that pot has been standing," she said, and took the pot away with her. Judith let out the breath she had been holding for what felt like the length of a page. By 11, the children were washed and mittened, and led through the paneled corridor to the oval green room. The dowager sat in her tall chair with the ebony cane resting against her knee. She did not rise. She lifted 2 fingers from her lap. Louisa curtsied to the depth of her age. Henry bowed from the shoulders, and Judith made the plainest and shortest reverence the room could carry without giving offense. "Miss Selby." "Your Grace." "The children read?" Louisa knows her letters as far as M. Henry construes La Fontaine with credit. With credit. The old woman turned the phrase over as one turns a coin. "How Norfolk you are with your praise, Miss Selby. Continue in that habit. It will preserve them from vanity." "Your Grace." The pale eyes moved once, briefly, to the linen collar. They moved on. "You will walk them along the Yew Avenue only, not the South Drive, not the Mere. The gardener will attend." "Yes, Your Grace." "That is all." Judith gathered the children and withdrew. They walked the Yew Avenue in the clean cold. Louisa dropped a mitten and was allowed to fetch it herself. Henry pointed to a rook and gave it a name in Latin that he had invented. The gardener followed 12 paces behind and did not speak. When they came back through the side door, Judith's cheeks were pink, and her hem was heavy with snow, and Mr. Pembridge was waiting at the foot of the small stair with a folded piece of paper in his hand. "For Miss Selby, from the schoolroom desk, His Grace's compliments." Judith took the paper. Her fingers, cold through the wool gloves, closed on it without hurry. "Thank you, Mr. Pembridge." "A reply is not looked for." He inclined his head half an inch and was gone up the corridor before she had unfolded the sheet. The children ran ahead. She stopped on the second landing where the tall window gave onto the snowed park and read. 3 lines, no more, in a hand she had last seen at 15. "Miss Selby, Henry inclines to history, Louisa to whatever is nearest. If it pleases you, an hour of the former on Wednesdays would relieve the tutor of Barry, who is old, Thornbury." She folded the sheet with the same care one uses on a bandage. She put it into the pocket of the walnut brown. She climbed the last flight without hurrying. In her own quarters, with the door shut and the bolt across, she took the note out again and held it to the light. The tea was made exactly as it had been made at Aylmer Barn on the harvest night, a small horizontal bar with a downstroke that dipped a hair below the line. The N stood square. The comma after history was the same lazy comma of a man who has never had to write for hire. She sat down on the edge of the counterpane and pressed both palms against her knees until they stopped shaking. He did not know her. He had written to Miss Selby as one writes to a governess of merit, and the merit had reached him through Louisa's morning report, or through Henry's grave face at luncheon, or through the plain fact that the primer he had glanced at last evening in the schoolroom had been legibly copied. That was all. She was not a woman who let her own hand tremble. She sharpened a new quill and wrote the reply on a half-sheet, in the round hand she had trained for 7 years to keep steady. "Your Grace, an hour of history on Wednesdays will suit both my pupil and me. A. Selby." She sealed it with plain wafer. She carried it herself to the housekeeper's tray at the foot of the small stair. At 3 o'clock, a footman came for her. Lady Cecily Wendover had arrived. Cecily was in the yellow morning room, still in her traveling pelisse of pea green, her copper curls disordered under the fur bonnet, her cheeks the color of a good apple. She turned as Judith entered, and for the briefest instant, the recognition ran naked between them across the polished floor. Then Cecily's face closed like a shutter, and her voice found the register of a mistress addressing a servant of some standing. "Miss Selby, Her Grace tells me the children are already reading La Fontaine. That is admirable. Your ladyship is kind. Come, tell me how they progress. I have known them since Henry was in short-coats." She waved off the footman with a flick of the pea-green cuff. The door closed. She waited 3 breaths. Then she crossed the room in one movement and took Judith by the elbows. "You look thin. What have they given you for supper?" "Cold mutton." "I did very well." "You did nothing of the kind." Cecily released her and stepped back to look at her properly, and her eyes filled without permission. "Judith." "Anne." "Anne, while these walls stand." "Anne, then Anne." She wiped the corner of her eye with the pea-green cuff and mastered herself, Sit. There. By the fire. Not on that stool. The stool is for the fool who comes on Fridays. Sit. Judith sat. Cecily poured chocolate from a small silver pot and put the cup into her hand and did not release her hand until she had felt it warm. You will drink that now, while I speak, because I have 12 minutes before Constance sends for me, and I will not waste one. I am listening. The Duke has kept a paper for 7 years. Judith set the cup down on the little marquetry table, because her wrist would not otherwise have obeyed. In the study behind the library, in the panel to the left of the mantel, I do not know what it says. I know he goes to it once a week and puts his hand on the door and does not open it, because Mrs. Farthing's second housemaid dusts that corner on Thursdays and has eyes, and I know that Constance, here Cecily's voice dropped to a level below the crackle of the fire, Constance keeps a folio in her private cabinet in the study of the west apartment. The folio is bound in black calf, the letters on the spine are worn, but Mrs. Farthing has read them. They spell one word, Aylmer. The chocolate steamed thinly between them. How long has it been there? 7 years. It was put in on the 15th of March, 1811, which was the week your father was buried, because the housemaid, who is now upper housemaid, was then a girl, and remembers the day because Constance struck her for spilling ink upon the study rug. Judith did not speak. She was measuring, slowly and steadily, the shape of a room she had never seen, and the depth of a lock she had not yet touched. Cecily reached across and lifted the cup back into her hand. Drink. You will be no use to any of us fainting on my chocolate. Judith drank. There is more. Tell me. Boscawen has been sent for. Not by me. By him. The cup did not shake this time. By the Duke? By the Duke. Yesterday, before you came, a dog cart with the initials O.B. left Cambridge in the small hours. Pembridge told my maid because Pembridge tells my maid everything since she left him a good scarf at Michaelmas. The Duke does not send for solicitors of Lincoln's Inn to draw a will. His will is drawn. He has sent for something else. He has sent for a paper. He has sent for a paper. Whether to open his own or to close another, I cannot say. They sat in silence while the fire settled. Somewhere above them, Louisa laughed her thin, bright laugh, and Henry answered in his 8-year-old bass. The sound was a small mercy that neither of them commented on. Cecily. Yes. You will not speak my name in this house, even under your breath. I will not. You will not write it in your journal for so long as I am here. I have already burnt 3 pages. The rest is safe. You will not let Constance see you look at me twice. I will barely look at you once. It will grieve me. She smiled, briefly, the same smile that had crossed a schoolroom floor 11 years ago. But it will be done. Tss. Judith rose. The chocolate was gone. The color had come back into her fingers, and with it, a clean, cold decision that did not show on her face. I have a walk to prepare for the children. I thank your ladyship for the news of the tutor of Barry. It relieves me. You are welcome, Miss Selby. Do carry my regards to Louisa. Tell her I have brought a length of pink ribbon. I shall. A curtsy, a retreat. At the door, Cecily's voice caught her, quiet and level. Anne. Yes, your ladyship. He was not the one who signed. Judith's hand rested a moment on the door handle. She did not turn. I have thought so for 7 years. Think so for 7 days more, then think again. Your ladyship. She closed the door behind her without sound. The Wednesday history hour began the following week, and it did not begin in the schoolroom. Mr. Pembridge appeared at 10 minutes to 11 and conducted Judith, Henry, and Louisa down 2 flights and along a stone-floored gallery to a small square room off the library called the map closet, where the walls were pasted with a great engraved chart of the Empire and a lower chart of the county of Suffolk. On the deal table lay a slate, 3 sharpened pencils, a folio of Roman coins under glass, and, at the far end, a single armchair upholstered in worn leather. The chair was empty. It remained empty for the first half hour. Judith read Henry through the fall of Carthage and let Louisa color a printed map of Italy with wax that had been carefully filed by someone who understood a child's grip. At 11:30, the door at the library end opened without ceremony, and the Duke came in with a book beneath his arm and sat down in the leather chair as one who has done so 100 times and does not require to be noticed. Henry stood. Sit, his uncle said without looking at him. Your governess is speaking. Judith went on. Her voice did not lift. Her voice did not drop. She named the elephants, the Alps, and the ambushes, as if she had been present at all three, and she let Henry ask the questions that occurred to him, because a boy who is watched does better if he is not. The Duke turned 2 pages of his own book in the length of an hour. He did not once look directly at her. Judith could feel where his eyes rested, on Henry's shoulder, on the map of Italy, on the fire, on the arch above the door, and she felt with equal certainty the moment his gaze passed across her writing hand, as she wrote a Roman date upon the slate. It rested there. It moved on. At noon the clock in the library struck. He rose, closed his book, inclined his head half an inch to Henry, half an inch to Louisa, and, after a fractional pause that only she and he could have measured, half an inch to her. "Miss Selby, Your Grace." He was gone before the second stroke. That night, when the corridor clock had struck 10 and the schoolroom fire was banked, she sat at the small deal table in her own room, with the quill in her hand and the primer open before her. She was not copying. She was writing on a scrap of blotting paper, in the round hand she had chosen for Anne Selby, 3 words over and over. Miss Anne Selby. She watched the S of Selby form itself. The shoulder curled the way her mother's shoulder had curled in the sampler that had burnt at Aylmer. The Y closed its loop the way her own Y had closed since she was 9. She looked at those 2 letters for a long minute and then dipped the pen again and wrote, this time deliberately, a 4th word. Aylmer. She looked at the 2 signatures side by side. She struck through the second. She burnt the scrap on the candle flame and pressed the ash flat with her thumb. Then she went to bed and did not sleep for an hour. In the library, 2 floors below, the Duke had not gone to his book. He stood by the panel to the left of the mantel with his palm laid flat upon it, exactly as he had done every Thursday for 7 years. Tonight it was not Thursday. Tonight was Wednesday. His hand did not linger the usual 3 seconds. He took it away, drew out his watch, considered the hour, and went to the writing table. He unlocked the topmost drawer with the smaller key on his fob and lifted from beneath a folded sheet of foolscap he had not opened since the year of his father's death, a single half-sheet in a woman's round hand. On it were 3 lines of a letter written 7 years before, and a signature. He set beside it the reply he had received that afternoon on plain wafer. Your Grace, an hour of history on Wednesdays will suit both my pupil and me. A. Selby. He looked at the S of Selby, he looked at the Y of Selby, he looked at the S in the older paper, humble and obedient servant, Judith Aylmer, and at the Y in the older name. He did not speak. He did not move for the space of a long breath. Then he folded the newer note along its crease, laid it beside the older, and locked both back into the drawer. He turned the key twice. He did not open the panel that night. He sat instead with his back to it, and drew towards him the household ledger for December, and entered a supper for 2 guests, expected on the 22nd. He wrote the initials O.B. in the guest column and set the pen down. His right hand rested a moment on the blotter beside the entry. On the little finger the signet ring of Thornbury caught the candle. He looked at it once, as a man looks at a tool whose weight he is measuring, and did not smile. There was a paper in his drawer whose S had lain quiet for 7 years. There was a paper in his mother's cabinet whose spine bore a name he had not spoken aloud in the same length of time. Between the 2, a governess of Norfolk Manor had walked into his house wearing a walnut-brown gown and a cameo she kept beneath her collar, and had written him back, on plain wafer, a line that in the shape of 2 of its letters accused everyone in this room but her. He was a man who had learnt young to make no motion he could not defend. He made none now. In the dowager's apartment at the far end of the west wing, Lady Constance sat in a wing chair by her own fire and made a small notation in her own book. Anne Selby, Norwich, of Norfolk Manor. Approved. She dipped her pen a second time and wrote below, Watch the cameo, watch the hand. She turned the page and wrote nothing further. The next morning brought a thaw that did not last. By Friday, the drive was iced again. By Saturday, Mrs. Farthing had let it be known below stairs that a Mr. Boscawen of Lincoln's Inn was expected to sleep 2 nights at Thornbury before Christmas, coming from Cambridge, and that the room called the writing closet on the ground floor was to be made ready for him with a good coal fire and a jug of hot ale each night. A stir went through the lower servants' hall of the sort that Judith recognized at once as the stir that runs before a piece of law walking into a house. At Sunday dinner in the servants' hall, Judith was permitted to dine there once a week as a courtesy to a governess and a punishment to a niece. The head groom said, without looking at anyone in particular, that the dog cart he was to fetch on Tuesday morning at the Blue Boar bore the initials O.B. carved into its footboard, small but neat, and that the little brown pony that came with it was very old and would need mash. Judith turned the piece of bread in her fingers and did not raise her eyes and said, "There is no snow expected." "None to speak of, Miss Selby." "Then the pony will do." Mrs. Farthing looked at her once, across the table, and looked away. The under-butler carved a second slice of cold beef for the head groom, and said the roads to Cambridge had been mended in October and would hold a light cart. The still-room maid asked whether the writing-closet chimney had been swept for the guest. Mrs. Farthing said it had. The under-butler said he had known a Mr. Boscawen once, in a case at Bury Assizes, a man who wrote his own letters in a hand so small a spectacle-maker had made his living by it. The head groom said that all lawyers wrote small, because they were paid by the page and knew it. There was mild laughter, of the sort that belongs to a lower hall in a house where the master is served, and the master does not know it. Judith folded her napkin and thanked Mrs. Farthing for the courtesy of the table and rose. In the corridor, Mr. Pembridge stood by the door of the plate room with his chain of keys quiet in his hand. He inclined his head half an inch as she passed. She returned it in exactly the measure a governess owes to a house steward, no less and not a hair more. Cecily came to the schoolroom the following afternoon with a length of pink ribbon and a pretense of consulting on Louisa's frock for Christmas Day. She stayed 40 minutes. In the last 3, she stood at the window with her back to Louisa and said, without moving her lips very much, "He arrives tomorrow at 3. Where will he be received?" "In the writing closet first. Then, before dinner, in the library, by the Duke alone. Constance is not asked. Constance will find a way to be present. She will try. She will fail this time?" He has instructed Pembridge, the doors are to be kept. Judith bent her head over Louisa's ribbon and passed the pink loop under the child's chin and tied a bow with fingers that did not tremble. "Thank you, Lady Cecily. The color becomes her. I thought it might." Cecily kissed the child on the parting of her hair and went out with her copper curls swaying and her cuff brushing the doorframe. That night the Duke did not come to the map closet. The children practiced their Latin declensions in the schoolroom instead and were sent to bed at 8. Judith heard, through the floor of her own room, the distant closing of the great study door 2 hours later and the double turn of a key. She rose from her chair, put on the shawl, and went to the window. Snow moved against the pane in small dry flakes. The park below was black under a thin gray sky. Somewhere in the yard a lantern lit for a moment and went out again. She thought of the S of Selby and of the Y and of the folio in the west apartment bound in black calf with a single worn word upon the spine. Thought of a paper behind a panel in the library that a man had touched every Thursday for 7 years. She thought of Marianne coughing in a Bedford room 4 counties away, and of £4 that must be sent by the coach on Monday whether the world held or did not. She thought of Peregrine Heathcote saying, "half an inch of inclination." Miss Selby. Below stairs the clock struck the half. In the lane beyond the great gate a wheel creaked once and was silent. Snow fell steadily upon a small brown pony that would need mash tomorrow, and upon the shoulders of a muffled driver whose lantern had at last gone out. Mr. Oswin Boscawen was 1 night's drive from Thornbury Hall. The morning of the 22nd broke thin and gray over the park, a slow uncovering rather than a dawn. Judith stood at the schoolroom window with the slate still cold against her arm, and watched a farm cart cross the far meadow, its wheels black on the hoar. Henry was already at his desk, feet swinging 6 inches above the boards, reciting the Kings of Wessex under his breath. Louisa arranged 3 pebbles from her pocket into a neat triangle beside the primer. "Egbert, Aethelwulf, Aethelbald," Henry said, then paused. "Miss Selby, is Aethelbald a name a person can truly bear?" "He bore it well enough for 5 years," Judith said. "Slate, please." She set them to copy a psalm in round hand, and while their pens scratched, she counted the hours forward. Boscawen at 3 in the writing closet. The Duke alone with him after, Pembridge at the doors, Constance not invited. She counted the money in the tin box in her head as well, 4 shillings and 3 pence, and Monday 4 miles away. At 9:30, Mrs. Farthing came in without knocking and set down a fresh pot of chocolate for the children. She looked once at Judith's collar and said nothing about the cameo hidden beneath it. "Her Grace desires that the children walk in the orangery this morning," Mrs. Farthing said. "The yew avenue is too wet. The gardener will attend." "Very good, Mrs. Farthing." The housekeeper did not go at once. She adjusted a chair that was already straight. "The writing closet on the ground floor has been made ready. Coal, ale, 2 candles. His Grace was particular. I hope Mr. Boscawen finds it comfortable." Mrs. Farthing's eyes met hers for the length of a breath. "You know the gentleman, then?" "I know the name from Cecily," Judith said, and turned the primer a 1/4 inch so the light fell on Louisa's L. Mrs. Farthing left. Judith did not touch the collar of her dress, though the wish rose in her fingers like a small heat. She had been careful, and being careful had become an exercise as continuous as breathing. At 11, she took the children through the long gallery to the orangery. Peregrine passed them at the head of the corridor with 2 grooms in low conference behind him. He did not stop. He inclined his head that same 1/2 inch and continued, his boots silent on the runner. Louisa lifted the rag rabbit and dipped her head in imitation of a curtsy, so grave that Henry laughed and was hushed. Judith kept her eyes on the carpet's border of vines. The orangery smelt of turned earth and old citrus. She sat with a book she did not read while the children ran between the tubs of myrtles, and she counted the strokes of the stable clock. 1, 2. It would be 3 before she saw him. She had promised herself that she would not go down. She would remain in the schoolroom until the interview was ended, and if he sent for her, he would send in writing, and she would answer in writing, and she would not go down until the words on the paper were words that could stand in daylight. At 2:30, Cecily appeared at the schoolroom door with her cheeks bright from the wind and a length of amber ribbon over her sleeve. She dismissed the children to Louisa's nurse with a laughing wave and closed the door behind them. "He came in at the north gate 3/4 of an hour ago," Cecily said, low. "The dog cart is round the stable. Pembridge took him straight to the writing closet. His Grace has been in his own library since noon, and no one has passed the door." Judith folded her hands over the primer. "Has she been told?" "Her Grace has been offered no message. Mrs. Farthing has been very deft about the tea trays." Cecily hesitated. "Dear, if he sends for you, he will not send for me. If he does, I will go," Judith said. Cecily sat down beside her and took her wrist and did not speak. In the courtyard, a bell rang once. Judith felt the small round bone of the cameo press against her collarbone through the linen. At 3 exactly, the writing closet door opened at the bottom of the servants' stair. Judith could not see it, but she heard it, because in Thornbury the corridors carried sound the way a shell carries water. A voice she had last heard in her father's bookroom at the age of 15 said, "Your Grace." And after a pause, another voice, quieter than she remembered, said, "Mr. Boscawen, come in." The door closed. Cecily's hand tightened on hers. For an hour the schoolroom was very still. Judith set out the copybooks, sharpened 3 quills, mended a nib, uncorked the pot of ink, and replaced the cork. Cecily stood at the window and watched the crows move across the paddock. Twice a bell rang somewhere below, unclear in its intention. At 4:10, a wafer-sealed note came up on Pembridge's own tray. It was addressed in the Duke's own hand to Miss Selby. 3 lines. His Grace requested the honor of her attendance in the library, at her convenience, before the hour of 5. He had, if she permitted, a matter for her private hearing. Judith read it twice. She stood. Cecily rose with her. "Not with me," Judith said. "No." Judith set down the note face upward on the primer, so that Cecily could see, if she needed to, that the invitation had been couched as a request and not a summons. She smoothed the front of the walnut-brown skirt with the palms of her hands. She retied the ribbon at the back of her hair. She lifted her chin exactly the 1/2 inch that a governess owes to a corridor, and no more. "If her Grace inquires," she said. "I shall be extremely stupid," Cecily said. Judith went down. The library door was open a hand's breadth. She saw first the fire, low and orderly. She saw the leather chair by the window turned so that its back was to the door. She saw the writing table, and on the writing table 2 papers laid flat and edge to edge, and between them, the plain wafer-sealed note she had sent up on Wednesday last, with A. Selby at the foot. Peregrine stood at the mantel. He turned as she entered. Boscawen sat in the wing chair with his brown pasteboard case across his knees, his spectacles pushed to the tip of his nose, his hands folded upon the leather as a man folds them over a Bible. He rose when she came in. "Miss Selby," said the Duke. "Your Grace? Mr. Boscawen has come from Lincoln's Inn upon a matter that concerns this house. I have desired his attendance for some time. He arrived this afternoon and has been an hour with me. I asked him to speak to you." He paused. His voice was very level, and by the levelness, Judith understood that he had prepared it. "You may go, if you wish. I do not press." Judith did not answer at once. She looked at Boscawen. The old solicitor met her eye and inclined his head, and it was the inclination of a man who had known her father's chair and her father's ink, and had once told her, at the age of 12, that a young lady should never sign her name with a flourish that could be copied. "I will stay," she said. "Sit, if you please." She sat. Peregrine did not sit. He remained at the mantel with his hand upon the marble. Boscawen opened the case upon his knees. He took from it, first, a folded quire of paper tied with green ribbon. "Miss Aylmer," he said quietly. Judith set both palms flat on her lap. "Forgive me," Boscawen went on. "I have known you since you wore short skirts. I shall not do you the discourtesy of pretending. I would rather have found you at a better time than this, and in a better dress than this. But time and dress are not to my choosing." She heard the Duke draw a slow breath at the mantel. "You will remember," Boscawen said, "that in the summer of the year 11, 3 months before your father's death, I drew up on his instruction a contract between his estate and the house of Thornbury. The terms of that contract were plain. Upon your father's decease, his lands at Aylmer and his shares in the Berry Bank were to be assigned in trust to your maintenance and to your sisters, and the trust was to remain in the guardianship of the head of the house of Thornbury until you both attained your majority." She said nothing. "In March of the year 11, 1 week after your father was buried, a document was received in my chambers, signed with your name. That document renounced the trust. It named the contract as void. It requested, in your hand, that all further correspondence be closed, and that the estate be permitted to pass to your father's creditors. It was signed Judith Aylmer, in a hand very like yours. It was witnessed. It was sealed." He looked up over the tops of his spectacles. "You did not sign it." Judith held her jaw quiet. She said, "No. I know that now. I did not know it then. I know it now because I have kept, in the strong room in Chancery Lane, the original counterpart of that contract, which was executed in 2 copies. I know it now because I have compared, this afternoon, the signature on the letter of renunciation with your hand upon the plain wafer note lying on that table. The curve of the S is not the same. The loop of the Y is not the same. The pressure of the pen upon the downstroke is a heavier stroke than yours. It was not your hand. It was the hand of someone who had seen your name written many times, and had, with skill, contrived the greater part of it. The someone did not have your dip." Peregrine had not moved from the mantel. He was looking at the coal. Boscawen laid the folded quire upon the table beside the 2 other papers. He did not open it. "The letter of renunciation was received in my chambers under cover from this house. The frank upon the outer wrapper was in the hand of the late Duke's mother, Constance, Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, then Duchess, and was witnessed at her instance by her steward and her chaplain, both since dismissed to livings that were not their own. The letter was accepted by me in good faith. It was upon that letter that the trust was collapsed and your father's affairs consigned to his creditors. It was upon that letter, and upon nothing else, that the door was closed." He paused. He removed his spectacles and folded them. "His Grace did not sign the letter received in my chambers. His Grace did not know that the letter had been sent. His Grace was in Portugal at the time and did not return until the November following, at which time the estate had been broken and its parts sold at auction. His Grace has kept, from the day of his return to this house, the letter of renunciation which came into his own hands under a covering note. He has kept it in a panel to the left of the mantel in this room. I have this afternoon opened that panel at his desire, and I have taken the letter from it, and I have laid it before him, and I have laid before it the wafer note which came to his hand on Wednesday last from the schoolroom of this house. There is no doubt in me, there is no doubt in him. The renunciation was not written by you. The wafer note is." She sat very still. The fire moved once and settled. She was aware of the pattern of the carpet under her shoe, and of the fact that her breath had gone into her shoulders, and of the fact that the small round bone of the cameo pressed against her collarbone through the linen, and of the fact that Peregrine had not looked at her since she came in. "I did not sign," she said, and her own voice was strange in her ears. "I was in Norwich in March of 11. I had no paper. I had no pen. I did not know that any letter had been sent, until the day the Bury sheriff came into our yard for the horses." "I know," said Boscawen. "I believed," she said, more carefully, "that the letter had been sent by the man who accepted it. I believed that the seal upon it was his." "It was," said Peregrine, from the mantel, very quietly. "It was my seal. My mother had my seal in her own writing desk, as she had many things in her own writing desk. She used it that March upon a paper written in a hand not hers, that pretended to be yours. She used it because she had determined that no daughter of your father was to enter this house upon my arm." He turned then. He looked at Judith for the first time since she had crossed the threshold. "I did not know," he said. "I was 6 weeks a duke and I was in Lisbon. I came home in November to a broken estate and a letter under my own seal that I had not written. I asked my mother. She told me it had come by post from your own hand, and had been laid by me before I sailed. She told me that I had signed it. I did not remember signing it. I did not remember, and I believed her, because a man of 26, who has never been called upon to remember a signature, does not know the shape of his own memory. I kept the letter. I kept the letter for 7 years in that panel. I looked at it twice a year on the days that I could bear to look at it. I did not open it in your presence, because I had come, over that time, to a doubt so great that I could not bring myself to test it, because if the doubt proved true, then everything that the house had done in your name had been done upon a lie. Do you understand me?" He had spoken quietly, but he had spoken continuously, and when he had done, he set his hand flat upon the mantel again and looked once at the fire. Judith made her mouth open and open again. "You did not know," she said. "I did not know. You did not close the door. I did not close the door. My mother closed the door under my seal in my absence. I let the door remain closed after my return, because I believed her, and I did not believe you had written to me since. I did not write to you because I had convinced myself that you did not wish it. It was, I now see, a precise and elegant lie that we have been told upon each other. I have been in it for 7 years. You have been in it for 7 years. It was a lie made by my mother's hand." He stopped. He turned back to the coal. "I have very little to give you now," he said. "That could be counted a repair, but I have this. Mr. Boscawen has this afternoon shown me the original counterpart of the contract of the year 11. The trust was not lawfully renounced. The estate was broken upon a forgery. The forgery was procured within this house. I have, at Mr. Boscawen's direction, this afternoon sealed a paper in his hand which conveys, out of my own private funds, restitution to your father's estate as it stood before the sheriff took the horses. The paper does not require your consent. It does not require your gratitude. I do not ask either. But you will be a woman of independent means from the moment that paper is registered in London, and it will be registered on Monday morning. Your sister will be a woman of independent means also." Boscawen was writing quietly upon a fresh sheet, his spectacles once more on the tip of his nose. Judith could not speak at once. She looked at the 2 signatures on the table, at the S that ran a curve at the shoulder, and at the Y with the small closed loop, both hers, upon 2 papers 7 years apart. She looked at the 3rd paper folded and tied in green ribbon that had been in a panel across the room from her every night since she had come to Thornbury. "You kept it," she said. "I kept it. You never opened it in her sight. Never in her sight. Never in yours until I knew whose hand it was." "How long," Judith said, "did you know?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been almost certain since the 5th minute after Mr. Pembridge presented you in the corridor with the children. I have been entirely certain since Wednesday, when I compared the wafer note with the letter in this drawer. I have not been able to say it aloud until this afternoon, because until this afternoon, Mr. Boscawen had not confirmed, from the counterpart of the contract, that the letter I had kept was in a hand that was not yours." He drew breath. "I did not send for you sooner, because I did not want to speak to you upon a suspicion I could not name. I did not want to give you either a hope or a hurt that I could not stand behind. I asked for the history lesson on Wednesdays because I could not, then, ask for anything else. She looked at her own hands and saw that they were quiet. "There is a matter more," said Boscawen, in the small, careful voice of a man who wishes to relieve a silence without entering it. "Miss Aylmer, His Grace has instructed that the settlement upon your father's estate be dated to March of the year 11, and calculated with interest. It will not restore your father, it will restore the roof at Aylmer, and it will restore the fields, and it will restore your sister to such medical attendance as her condition may require. I have taken the liberty, upon His Grace's word, of writing this morning to the Kempston physician, Dr. Halloway the younger, and to the Bedford apothecary, and I have taken the further liberty of instructing Mrs. Pettifer, at number 4 Cardington Row, to consider herself upon this house's account from this Monday forward. A carriage will be at her door on Monday at 8. Your sister will be moved to Bury as soon as her strength permits, and to Thornbury, when her Grace's household has been rearranged." Judith heard the words and understood them, a phrase behind their delivery. Mrs. Pettifer, Marianne, Monday. The £4 she had not been sure how to send. "Mr. Boscawen," she said, and her voice held, "I do not know how to speak to you. You need not. I have known your father. I have known your hand since you were 12. He would have written to you at present with much what I have written. I have taken his place because I have outlived him, and because the case required a plain man." He set down his pen. "That, Miss Aylmer, is the greater part of the plain." She turned to Peregrine. He had not looked at her since he had said, "Your sister will be a woman of independent means also." He was looking at the coal as though the coal were the only surface in the room that would consent to be looked at. "Your Grace," she said. He did not turn. "Your Grace, my sister is 14 years of age, and she has a cough that has grown deeper in the last week, and I have known, for a fortnight, that I have not £4 to send on Monday to her nurse. I do not know how to hold what you have said. If I try to hold it in this hour, I shall not hold it, but I wish you to know that I have heard it." He inclined his head. Once. It was the same half-inch he had given her in the corridor the day she came, and it was, she saw now, the only inch of his that he had permitted himself. "You need not hold it in this hour," he said, low. "You need only be aware that no house in England shall stand between your sister and a physician after this evening." Boscawen tied the green ribbon back around the letter of renunciation. He set the wafer note upon it. He set upon them both, from his own case, a third paper, folded in quarters, upon which, Judith could see, was the smaller, neater hand of the solicitor himself, and at the bottom the black wax and gold signet of Thornbury. "His Grace," Boscawen said, "will require, before Twelfth Night, that these 3 papers be produced before the family council and the 2 witness peers whom His Grace shall name. It is not I who will name them, it is His Grace. I am instructed to say to you, Miss Aylmer, that Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess, has not yet been made aware of my presence in this house upon this matter, and that it is His Grace's intention that she should not be so made aware until the household has been ordered to his satisfaction. Until that hour, I ask you to continue in your present situation and under your present name. It is a great deal to ask, and I know it, but we ask it." She thought of Constance's small blue eyes over the tea, and of the note in the private book. Watch the cameo, watch the hand. She thought of Cecily upstairs waiting with the amber ribbon still on her sleeve. She thought of Marianne on the narrow bed at Cardington Row, and of the Monday coach, and of the 4 shillings and 3pence in the tin box. "I will continue," she said. "Thank you. Until Twelfth Night. Until we call for you." She stood. Peregrine turned. He did not cross to her. He did not offer her his arm. There was between them, in the quiet room, a distance kept as carefully as the distance a governess owes to a house steward, and she understood, from the care of it, that he was holding it for her sake and not for his own. She curtsied, not the half-inch of a governess, slightly deeper and slightly slower. He returned the bow of a man to a woman of his own house. At the door she paused and turned. "Your Grace," she said, "the panel." "Yes. You have kept it closed for 7 years. "Yes. I would like to see it open." He crossed the room. He set his hand upon the left of the mantel. He pressed a molding no thicker than a finger, and a small door of walnut opened silently upon a shallow cavity, lined in green baize. It was empty now because Boscawen had taken the letter from it, but there was in the cavity a second thing that Judith had not expected, and that she understood at once, and that she would not touch, because to touch it in this hour would break her. There was a small square of folded paper, yellowed at the folds. It had been laid in the cavity beneath where the letter had lain. It was the note he had written her at the harvest, at Aylmer, when she was 15 and he was 23, when she had gone up the stairs to fetch her mother's shawl and had found it on her pillow, one line. She did not move to take it. He did not move to give it. He closed the panel, quietly. "Not now," he said. "Not now." She left the room. In the corridor, Mr. Pembridge stood at the door of the small stair with a candle in a plain brass holder, ready to be given her, because dusk had come while she had been within, and the schoolroom stair was unlit. She took the candle from him. He inclined his head half an inch. She returned the inclination in the exact measure a governess owes to a house steward, no less and not a hair more, and she climbed to the 3rd floor west with the flame steady in her hand and the walnut brown of her sleeves shining faintly in the small light. And behind her in the library, at the mantel, Peregrine, Duke of Thornbury, laid the flat of his palm once upon the shut panel and left it there while the coal fell in. Above stairs, Cecily was waiting in the schoolroom with the amber ribbon still upon her sleeve and the pot of chocolate quite cold. She did not ask. She only rose and took the candle from Judith's hand and set it upon the mantel and put her arms about her and held her a moment. Judith did not weep. She had not wept in 7 years, and she did not begin now. "He did not sign," she said, into Cecily's shoulder, so quietly that Cecily heard it more as a movement of air than as a word. "No, dearest, he did not. It was her. Yes. He kept it 7 years. Yes." Judith drew back. She wiped nothing from her face. She smoothed the front of the walnut-brown skirt with the palms of her hands, and she said, in a voice that was almost her governess's voice again, "Cecily, I must write to Mrs. Pettifer this evening. There is a carriage on Monday." "There is a carriage on Monday," Cecily agreed. "I shall have paper brought." Below stairs, in the great hall, Mr. Boscawen took his leave in the writing closet with a small glass of ale and a plate of cold mutton set upon a tray. He wrote out, in his own miniature hand, 3 letters, one to the bishop's registrar at Bury, one to the Duke's man of business in London, one to the Kempston physician. He sealed each with black wax and gave them to Pembridge, and drank his ale slowly, and did not speak again until the writing closet clock struck 7. In the west apartment, Lady Constance, Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, sat with her tea untouched at her elbow and turned the leaves of her private book. She had heard, through Mrs. Farthing, that a gentleman of the law had arrived at the house at 3 and had gone straight into the writing closet. She had heard, through the second footman, that his Grace had received him alone. She had heard nothing since. She wrote, in the private book, beneath "Watch the cameo, watch the hand," a single further line. She wrote, "Who is the man in the ground-floor closet?" and she underlined the word "man" twice. She rang for Mrs. Farthing. In the library, Peregrine crossed to the writing table. He took up the 2 signatures side by side, and the folded letter tied in green ribbon, and he set them in the drawer at his right hand, and he turned the key upon them, and he sat down, and he set his hand flat upon the closed drawer, and he did not lift it for a long while. Upstairs, Judith sat down with fresh paper and a mended pen at the schoolroom table. She wrote out 4 lines to Mrs. Pettifer at No. 4 Cardington Row. "A carriage will call on Monday at 8. Do not open the door to any but the driver named Withers, of Bury. Marianne is to be wrapped very warmly. I shall come to Bedford within the week." She signed it, without hesitation, A. Selby, and the S ran its curve at the shoulder, and the Y closed its loop, and she sealed it with a plain wafer, and set it upon the tray for Pembridge to send. Then she blew out the candle. In the dark she lifted her hand once to her collar, and touched the cameo where it lay hidden against her skin, and she said aloud, to no one but the empty room, it was not him. At 8:30, in the west apartment, Mrs. Farthing, standing very upright, told her Grace that Mr. Oswin Boscawen, of Lincoln's Inn, had been in the house since 3 that afternoon, and that his Grace had received him alone, and that his Grace had, at 5, sent for the governess, and had kept her in the library 20 minutes, and that the governess had come out with a candle from Mr. Pembridge, and had gone upstairs, and had not come down. Lady Constance heard this in silence. She did not thank Mrs. Farthing. When Mrs. Farthing had gone, she rose. and crossed to the small locked cabinet in the corner of her sitting room, and she took from about her neck a small chain and a small key, and she opened the cabinet, and she stood a long while looking at the black calf folio on the second shelf, spine-lettered Aylmer, and she did not put out her hand. She closed the cabinet. She locked it. She rang. "Mrs. Farthing, have my carriage ready at 8:30 tomorrow. I shall call upon the bishop at Bury before 9. The carriage rolled out of Thornbury Hall at 8:28, the wheels cutting 2 dark ribbons through the fresh snow of the East Drive. Lady Constance sat straight against the blue morocco cushion, her gloved hands folded on the silver knob of her ebony cane, her face composed. Beside her, Mrs. Farthing kept her eyes on the road and a folded shawl across her knees. Neither spoke. The Dowager Duchess had asked no questions of her housekeeper past the necessary ones, and Mrs. Farthing had offered none. Inside the schoolroom above, Judith set a fresh sheet before Louisa and told Henry to try his Latin verbs. She had slept perhaps 2 hours. Her wrist ached from the copy she had made of the letter to Mrs. Pettifer at dawn. She did not look toward the drive when the carriage passed under the lime avenue, though she heard the wheels through the shut window and knew whose they were. At 9:15 the same morning, Peregrine received Boscawen in the library. The solicitor had risen early, dictated to a small book already half filled, and taken a cup of chocolate standing. "She will be with the bishop by now," Peregrine said. Boscawen nodded once. "His Grace of Bury will listen with courtesy and remit her to the counsel of her son. That is the shape of the thing. She cannot proceed against a duke in his own house on a Wednesday morning without the counsel of her son, and she knows it. She will not proceed, she will inquire." "She will inquire," Boscawen agreed, "and she will find that inquiry has already been made." Peregrine set his palm briefly upon the panel to the left of the mantel, then withdrew it. "The papers?" "With the registrar of Bury by 10, in town by post tomorrow. The counterpart is safe in Chancery Lane. Then we have 4 days until 12th night." "We have 4 days," Boscawen said, "and 1 supper." The 1 supper was the small reception of the 23rd of December, arranged 3 weeks earlier for the neighborhood. The 2 families from Bury who kept the county pleasant, the vicar of St. Cuthbert's, Sir Marcus Anstey and his sister, Lady Cecily, who was already in the house, and the Comtesse de Villeroi from Paris by way of Vienna, presented into the country by a cousin of the Anstey side, and lodged for 3 nights at Thornbury, against the courtesy of the Duke's mother. Peregrine had forgotten the Comtesse until Pembridge, entering with the day's correspondence, mentioned that her woman had gone down before her to inspect the dressing-room and had asked for a warming pan of French silver rather than English brass. Peregrine, who was thinking of a train of paper from Chancery to Bury, said only, "Give her the brass, Pembridge, and beg her woman's pardon." Boscawen, who missed nothing, watched a pen move upon a page and said nothing at all. By 11, Judith had been told twice by Mrs. Farthing's second, a thin housemaid named Prim, that the reception was to proceed as arranged, that Miss Selby was to keep the children upstairs for the evening, and that supper would be served for 18 in the small dining room. Prim added, at the door, that the French lady had asked which of the household went out among the guests, and had been told none. Judith set down her chalk and thanked her. Cecily came at noon in a plain morning dress and stood at the window with her back to the door. She waited until Louisa had gone with Prim for a fitting of her new sash. "She is not at Bury," Cecily said quietly. Judith turned. "The bishop received her at 9:30 and released her at 10, Cecily continued. "She took no refreshment. Her carriage did not return the North Road. She has gone to Anstey." "Anstey?" "To Sir Marcus. He is a magistrate. He is also her cousin at 3 removes. She will not lay any information. There is nothing yet to lay, but she will ask what may be laid." Judith folded her hands upon the desk. Her thumb moved once across the ink stain on her right forefinger. "The Comtesse arrives at 4. "The Comtesse arrives at 4, Cecily said, "and Marcus dines here at 7. They did not speak the next thing aloud, but each understood it. If Constance had gone to Sir Marcus before he came under this roof, she had gone to arrange his ears before Peregrine could speak into them. At 3, snow began again, small and dry, the kind that whitened stone without softening it. Judith gave the children their milk in the schoolroom and set them to a puzzle of the counties. Louisa laid Norfolk in Norfolk and Suffolk in Suffolk and put Bedford in Warwickshire on purpose to make her brother laugh. Judith laughed with them once, gave Bedford back to Louisa, and did not think of Cardington Row. At 3:30, she went to her own chamber to dress. The walnut-brown gown was clean, the linen collar starched. She fastened the mother-of-pearl cameo at her throat and, remembering the dowager's instruction, tucked it inside the collar so that only a suggestion of its weight told against the linen. Then, on the small resolution of a woman preparing for the last long night of an old life, she brought it out again and let it lie plainly upon the walnut cloth. She looked at herself in the small square glass. The face there was thinner than it had been in Bedford. The mouth had grown quiet. She went down. The Comtesse de Villeroi had arrived at 4:10. She was already in the yellow drawing-room when Judith crossed the marble hall on her way to the housekeeper's room, and she was not in the yellow drawing-room alone. 2 footmen stood by the tea-tray. Mrs. Farthing had returned from Bury with the dowager and stood by the second window. Pembridge held the door. Lady Cecily was making the necessary courtesies, and the Comtesse, tall, thin, with pale green eyes above a small red mouth, was extending a hand to Constance. Judith crossed the doorway 3 feet within, no more, and made the small curtsy required of a governess who has been observed by a member of the family. She meant to withdraw. She would have withdrawn. But the Comtesse turned her head with a quickness that was not quite civil, and looked at her. "Ah," said the Comtesse in French, smiling. "The English governess." Constance inclined her head 1/2 inch. "Miss Selby, madame." "Miss Selby," repeated the Comtesse, tasting the name. In French, still, and softer, she added, "Come nearer, child. Do not stand in the door as if you feared the fire." Judith came nearer 3 steps and stopped. She kept her eyes upon the carpet, where the pattern turned from cream to pale rose beneath the tea-table. The Comtesse crossed the room. Her walk was easy and long. She stopped a foot from Judith and put out one gloved finger and turned back the linen collar of the walnut-brown gown with the tip of it, as one might turn a page. The cameo lay against the cloth. "You wear a pretty thing for a schoolroom," the Comtesse said, still in French. Then, in English, gentle as milk, "Was it your mother's?" Judith did not answer. "Come," said the Comtesse. "One may say yes without shame. In France, we do not despise a mother." She turned to Constance and added, in a French that was too swift for a governess of Norfolk Manor to have followed, and had followed anyway, "One knows the sort. A lady in the making, poorly made. She will marry a curate and die in childbed. It is a mercy she does not know." Constance's mouth did not change. She said, in English, "Miss Selby has excellent hands with the children." "Ah," said the Comtesse, "hands." She was 3/4 of a turn back toward the tea-tray when it happened, and it happened as such things happen, not as accident but as the shape of accident. Her long saffron train drew across the carpet. Judith, having taken 1 step backward toward the door, was in its path only by the smallest error of retreat. The heel of the Comtesse's slipper caught. The Comtesse turned to save her balance. Her elbow came down, and the cameo, unclasped by the earlier turn of the gloved finger, Judith had felt the small give of it, and would afterwards not know whether the clasp had truly held, fell. It struck the marble at the edge of the carpet with a small, clear sound, like a coin dropped on stone. Then the Comtesse's slipper came down upon it, and the sound was different, a soft crunch, dry as a walnut shell under a boot. The Comtesse looked down. She lifted her foot with the delicacy of a woman avoiding a puddle. She saw the crushed shape of pearl and silver, the tiny E and A that had lain against the throat of a woman dead these 15 years, now white splinters upon the marble. "Ah, mon Dieu," she said, in the tone one uses for a broken saucer. "The poor thing has dropped her ornament." Cecily had come forward. Cecily said, "Leonie?" Constance said, without moving, "Pembridge, a dustpan." Judith did not kneel. She did not move at all. Her hand went, of itself, to the empty place at her throat, and stayed there, palm flat, 3 seconds. Then she brought it down and folded it over the other hand at her waist. "It is nothing," she said. Her voice was quiet and very level. "I beg your pardon, madame. It was clumsy of me to stand in your way." The Comtesse smiled. "The child speaks well. She has been well taught. I congratulate you, Duchess." She looked at Judith. "You will find the wire in the pieces. If you gather them, it may be mended in Bury. There is a jeweler, but the pearl, no, the pearl is gone. Yes, madame. Judith turned. She crossed the drawing room to the door. She did not curtsy at the threshold, because a governess withdrawing from a room where she has been publicly humiliated does not curtsy at the threshold, and no one in that room called her back to require it. She walked the length of the marble hall and up the great stair to the first landing, and along the corridor of portraits to the small stair that led to the schoolroom floor. She met no one. She turned into her own chamber and shut the door. She stood a long moment with her hand upon the ferralo. Then she drew it. She sat on the edge of the iron bed. She put her hands upon her knees, and then upon her face, and then upon her knees again. She did not weep. She had not wept in the library the night before, and she did not weep now. It was not that she felt no grief for the small dead thing on the marble downstairs. It was that grief, in a woman who has learned to copy letters at 3 pence a page, arrives on a different clock. She thought, quite steadily, of the Duke. He had not been in the drawing room. He had been somewhere in the house, a library, a study, the west corridor, and he did not yet know. She thought of Cecily's face when the Comtesse had said Leonie. She thought of Constance, who had asked for a dustpan. She rose. She went to the small desk under the window. She took a sheet of paper and dipped her pen and wrote 3 lines. She addressed the folded sheet to His Grace the Duke of Thornbury, and she went to the door of her chamber and put it in her apron, and she went down the small stair. She met Pembridge on the second landing. She said, without preface, "Please give this to His Grace when he is next alone, Mr. Pembridge. There is no answer required this hour." Pembridge took the folded sheet. He looked at it and at her and said, "Miss Selby." "Mr. Pembridge." "His Grace is presently in the library. He is alone. Then, when he next takes his tea." "Miss Selby." She went past him and up the small stair again. In her own chamber, she stood for a full minute against the closed door, breathing. The knock came before she had finished breathing. It was not Pembridge's knock. She opened the door 6 inches. It was Prim, the housemaid, pink to the ears, holding a covered basket. "If you please, miss. Mrs. Pettigrew and the young lady be come." Judith did not understand. "Mrs. Pettifer, miss," said Prim, more slowly. "And the young lady from Bedford, in the housekeeper's carriage. Mrs. Farthing bid me to bring them up by the back stair, as her Grace is engaged below." Judith opened the door. They were behind Prim on the small landing already, and Mrs. Pettifer was carrying the young lady from Bedford in her own arms, as if she were 4 instead of 14. Marianne's cheek was against the old shoulder, and Marianne's eyes were half open, and Marianne's lips were the color of the wax on a wafer. "Oh, my lamb," Mrs. Pettifer said, and set her charge upon the counterpane of the iron bed, and stood, breathing hard. "Withers of Bury came for us before day. There was no letter, Miss Judith. There was only him at the door, and the pair harnessed, and a fur rug he had bought out of his own pocket in Cambridge. He said the Duke had ordered it 4 days back, and the little one has been so bad since Sunday, and Dr. Halloway is a good man, but he is a good man in Kempston, and so we come." Judith went to the bed. She put her hand on Marianne's forehead. It was hot with a heat that had passed the shivering stage. "Marianne." The eyes opened wider. The mouth made half a smile. "Judy," Marianne said, "you've a fine room." "I have," Judith said. "You shall lie in it now, and I will bring you soup." "There's a cat downstairs," Marianne said. "Prim let me touch him. He hadn't a name." "He shall have one. You shall give him one." Mrs. Pettifer had lowered herself into the small chair by the fire. Her eyes were streaming quietly without her attending to them. "There was no letter, Miss Judith. Only him at the door. And the Duke's man in Bury told him she was to have a proper doctor. And we come." "I know," Judith said. "I know." Prim, wisely, had gone. She returned within 10 minutes with a warmed brick for the girl's feet, a jug of milk and water, a rush lamp, and the whispered word that Mrs. Farthing would send Dr. Halloway of Kempston up as soon as he could ride. Judith put the brick at the foot of the bed and unlaced Marianne's boots and drew the coverlet to her chin and sat down and took the small hand. The clock on the schoolroom landing struck 6. At 6:12, Prim came again. Her face this time was pinched. "If you please, miss, Her Grace begs the favor of a word in the small parlor behind the chapel." "Now, Prim?" "Now, miss." Judith looked at Mrs. Pettifer. Mrs. Pettifer nodded once with her whole seamed face and said, "I will sit with her." Judith went down. She followed Prim by the small stair to the ground floor, and along a passage she had not been in, and through a low door into a room she had not seen. It had one lamp on a table, one chair by the fire, and one small settle against the panel. Lady Constance stood at the table. She was still in her purple fumo morning silk, her lace cap unchanged, her hands upon the ebony cane. She did not sit. "Miss Selby." Judith stood inside the door. "Miss Selby, we are not going to fence. I am past the age for fencing, and you are past the age for it also. I have been to Bury this morning. I have been to Anstey this afternoon. I am not deceived, and I have not been for some days. Let us dispense with it." Judith said nothing. "You are Judith Aylmer of Norfolk. You came into this house on false name, false character, and false grounds, upon the writing of Cecily Wendover, who has for that reason lost the friendship of my house. You were engaged by me for the education of my grandchildren. You have discharged the office with credit. You have also, whether by design or by luck, put my son in the way of a folly which he now proposes to make public. That folly cannot be permitted. Madam, you will hear me. What you have done to yourself in coming here I do not condescend to remark. What you have done to my son I cannot forgive. But I am not without observation. There is a child upstairs. That child is your sister. She has been ill since Bedford. She will not do well in this weather. There is no physician in this county who cannot be got to Thornbury by dinner if the summons goes out over the seal of the Dowager." Constance moved one step nearer. "I have a house at Kempston. It is small, it is my own, it is warm, and it is 1 mile from a physician of Edinburgh training whom I retain by the year. That house may be yours from tomorrow week, with the freehold, without deed of gift, without your name upon it, held in trust by Mr. Pointer of Bury, and administered by him, £200 a year to keep it. The child shall have Dr. Halloway of Kempston and Dr. Verrall of Bath, and any nurse the two of them together shall name. The old woman shall have her chimney and her tea. You shall have your quiet." Judith heard herself breathe once. "I ask one thing," Constance said. "You shall go from this house tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight, before the supper is served. Withers shall drive you to Bury, and you shall lodge at the White Hart, and Pointer shall wait upon you in the morning, and the child shall be conveyed by an easier stage to Kempston within the week, under Dr. Halloway's supervision. You will not write to my son. You will not receive from him. You will not be found in any house in which he may sit at a table. My daughter, who is now at Anstey, shall stand your friend in Bury, if you are ever spoken against." She waited. "You will not marry, of course," Constance added, without unkindness. "That is settled by the nature of what has passed, but you will be safe, and your sister will live, and you will have your walnut brown, and your books and your quiet, and my son will keep the honor of his house, which is what he was born to keep. He is not free to marry you, Miss Aylmer. His mother has ruined him too far for that. Take what I can give and go." Judith looked at the lamp for a long moment. She said, quite low, "You broke him further than that this morning, madam." Constance said nothing. "You wrote in your own book last week to watch the hand," Judith said, "and this morning you went to Bury to prevent what you already knew was done. My father died in March 11, madam. He died believing that the Marquis of Kelsey had signed the paper that closed my house. He died in a small back room in Downham because he had no other room. I have been 7 years about the world with the name of a woman I never was. And this evening in your yellow drawing room, a Frenchwoman broke my mother's cameo with the heel of her slipper because you seated her at your side." She stopped. She was not shaking. Her hand at her waist was quite still. "I cannot take your house at Kempston, madam. I will not take it, and I will not go tonight. I gave my word 4 days back to His Grace, and to Mr. Boscawen, that I should keep Miss Selby's name until 12th night. I mean to keep that word. What my sister needs, my sister shall have. She shall have it under this roof, or she shall have it under my own, but she shall not have it from your hand." Constance considered her. "You are proud," she said at last, without heat. "That is a family fault. Your father had it. It ruined him." "He was not ruined by his pride, madam. He was ruined by yours." The dowager's hand tightened once upon the cane, then it eased. "Very well," she said. "You have chosen. Do not hereafter mistake me for a woman who did not offer." She crossed to the door. She paused with her hand upon it. "I do not," she said, "wish the child ill. Whatever is thought of me hereafter, that at least I ask you to believe. Dr. Halloway is riding up. He will attend her tonight without reference to my other business. Withers shall not be sent for you. You may keep your room." She went out. Judith stood for the space of half a minute in the small room with the one lamp. Then she went along the passage the way she had come, and up the small stair, and into her own chamber. Mary Ann had fallen into a fever sleep. Mrs. Pettifer sat by the bed with her hand upon the child's wrist and her lips moving in a prayer she had learned in a barn in Norfolk in 1774. Judith knelt on the boards by the bed. She put her forehead against the side of the mattress. She did not cry there either. She stayed so a long minute, and Mrs. Pettifer, without looking at her, put a hand upon the crown of her head and left it there. Below, in the yellow drawing-room, the small clock of Ormolu struck 7. The vicar of St. Cuthbert's had arrived. Sir Marcus Anstey had arrived with his sister. Lady Cecily was already at the fire, holding the Comtesse in conversation, with a courtesy that had a stone under it. The Duke came in at 3 minutes past 7. He crossed the room to his mother, kissed her hand, greeted the Comtesse in French of a quiet and formal kind, spoke to the vicar of the parish poor, and did not once look at the door. Pembridge at the sideboard watched him. In the pocket of Pembridge's coat lay Judith's folded sheet, still sealed. Pembridge had understood, without being told, that a folded sheet delivered before supper is worse than a folded sheet delivered after supper, and that the small parlor behind the chapel had been used at 6, and that Miss Selby had not come down to eat. He carried the sheet in his pocket through the fish and the roast and the 2 sweet things, and at 9:30, when the party rose, he crossed the corridor with the tray and set the sealed sheet by the Duke's own hand upon the writing table in the library. But that was 3 hours off. At 7:30, in the west chamber of the 3rd floor, Mary Ann opened her eyes and said, "Judy? The cat downstairs?" Prim called him Bramble. "May I keep him?" "Only for a night." "Only for a night," Judith said. "He shall come up when he pleases." "Then he pleases now," Mary Ann said, and smiled, and shut her eyes. Mrs. Pettifer, weeping quietly, said, "She has been so long ill." Judith put her hand upon the child's forehead. It was hotter than an hour before. Dr. Halloway of Kempston, who had ridden without stopping since a boy came to his door at 5, was at the front porch at 7:50. Pembridge, who had left the sideboard to a footman for the space of 2 minutes, met him himself at the door and took him up the small stair and into the west chamber. He was a plain man of 40, mud to the knees, and he set his bag upon the chair without preamble and knelt by the bed and put his fingers upon the small wrist and his ear to the small chest and listened. When he lifted his head at last, he did not look at Judith. He looked at Mrs. Pettifer. "How many nights has it gone so?" "4, sir, and a bit." "And the Bedford man saw her?" "He did not come, sir. He would not, without 2 guineas. Dr. Halloway said something under his breath that was not a physician's phrase, and stood. "Miss Selby." "Sir." "I shall stay in the house. I shall want boiled water and clean linen every 2nd hour, and a woman by turns to sit with her. I shall want the smallest possible noise in the room, and I shall want nothing said to her that she may hear which she would rather not. It is a lung congestion. She has strength of a sort. She has kept alive on that strength alone. Whether she has enough of it left is between her and her God tonight." Judith heard her own voice say, "Yes, sir. I shall speak to His Grace in the library within the hour, if His Grace is at leisure." "He is at leisure," Judith said. She was still on her knees by the bed. She had not risen. Dr. Halloway looked at her. Something in the look was a professional man's fatigue, and something in it was not. He said more quietly, "Miss Selby, she has a chance. I have seen worse come through. Do not think tonight what you may as well think tomorrow." He went out. Prim brought the boiled water and the linen. Mrs. Pettifer took the first watch. Judith sat in the chair by the fire, upright, her hands folded, her back straight, her eyes upon her sister's face, and did not move. At 10 minutes past 9, from the passage below, she heard the small clocks of the hall answer one another through the shut door. At 9:30, she heard, faint through the boards of the west wing, the doors of the yellow drawing-room open, and the guests moved down the corridor of portraits toward the small dining-room. She heard, more faintly, a woman's laugh, light, French, unashamed. The child on the bed drew a breath that hitched at the top. Judith rose from the chair and went to the bed and took the small hand in her own and held it. She did not pray. She had not the words tonight. She only held the hand and watched the small chest lift and fall, and lift and fall, and lift. Below, in the library that Miss Selby was not to enter between 9 and 11, the Duke of Thornbury sat down at the writing table and saw a folded sheet upon the leather. He knew the hand before he broke the seal. The 3 lines within said, "Your Grace, my sister lies ill in the West Chamber. Mrs. Pettifer is with her. Dr. Halloway attends. I shall not come down. Forgive me. A.S." He read the 3 lines twice. Then he stood and put the sheet into the inner pocket of his coat and crossed the room to the panel to the left of the mantel. He pressed the molding. The panel opened. He did not take the folded amber paper that lay beneath the place where the forged letter had been. He looked at it. He shut the panel again with a soft click. He rang once for Pembridge. "Pembridge, Your Grace. Send to Dr. Halloway that I shall wait upon him in the schoolroom passage at 10 precisely. Your Grace. And send word to my mother that her carriage will be at the door at 7 tomorrow morning. She will oblige me by being in it." Pembridge, who had been 61 years upon this earth, and 40 of them in the service of dukes, said only, "Your Grace." He did not, in going out, permit himself the smallest change of face, but he understood that the house had turned upon its hinge, and that the hinge, tonight, was a small hand in a west chamber on the 3rd floor. Upstairs, Judith held the small hand and counted the breaths, and the fire made its small settling noises in the grate, and the snow, beginning again beyond the shut window, laid itself down upon the roofs of Thornbury in a silence that was almost, but not quite, the silence of a house at prayer. The snow did not stop before dawn. It thickened. By 6 o'clock, Judith had counted every hour on the tallow candle and every shift of Marianne's breath, and only when the first gray pushed against the shutters did the small chest under her hand rise easier, and rise again, and stay risen. Mrs. Pettifer, upright in her chair, opened her cataract-clouded eyes and knew before she was told. She said only, "Praise be," and lowered her forehead onto her folded fingers. Marianne slept then, properly, mouth slightly open, one hand curled loose upon the counterpane. Prim came in without a knock at 6:15, carrying a basin of hot water, and set it down as though it might crack. She looked at the bed. Her face changed. "His Grace desires to know," she whispered, "the moment there is anything to be said." "There is," Judith said. "Tell him the fever has broken." Prim went out on her toes. Judith heard, 3 flights below, the quiet slide of a bolt drawn back, and, further off, the tread of horses being brought round to the north front. At 7 minutes to 7, Mr. Pembridge in full black stood outside the dowager's apartments in the west wing, with a folded sheet of paper in his gloved hand. 2 under-footmen stood behind him with a small traveling trunk between them. Behind the footman, motionless, waited Mr. Boscawen, spectacles pushed high on his nose, brown pasteboard portfolio under his arm. Constance received them dressed, her stays already laced. She had not slept. The cameo of sardonyx was at her throat. She looked at Pembridge and did not sit down. "Your Grace," Pembridge said, quite level. "His Grace desires that you be in the carriage before the clock strikes." She held out her hand. Pembridge laid the folded paper on her palm. She did not open it in front of him. She had waited too long at the bishop's door in Bury the day before to give a servant that satisfaction. "By whose leave?" she said. "Does my son send me from my house at 7 of the morning?" "By his own, Your Grace. By his sole leave." The under-footman did not move. Boscawen did not move. She looked once, briefly, at the small cabinet at the far wall. The key still hung at her throat on its short chain. She weighed, for the space of a breath, whether she had time to take from that cabinet what was in it. Boscawen said, "The cabinet, madam, is now under a magistrate's seal. Sir Marcus Anstey signed it at 4:30 this morning. His Grace desired that you be informed." Constance's mouth closed, then closed again, more finally. She was in the carriage at 3 minutes to 7. She left behind the folio and black calf. She left behind the pearls of the second string. She left behind, above all, the notion that the house had ever been hers to hold. The carriage rolled out under the north portico while the great clock in the hall struck 7. Judith, 3 floors above, heard the wheels on the frost-hard gravel and did not go to the window. She stayed by Marianne. That was the point. At 9:30, Dr. Halloway from Kempston came up the small stair in his stockinged feet, so as not to wake the child, examined her, listened at her chest with a wooden trumpet, and gave one small, professional nod. He said the girl would keep her lungs. He said she would be at a window in a week. He said she would ask for the cat before she asked for the bread. Marianne opened her eyes when he said the word cat. "Bramble," she said. "Bramble," Judith answered, and did not weep, because she had promised herself a long time ago not to weep in a house where her mother's cameo had been ground into the floor. Cecily, in a wrapper of jonquil silk over her nightgown, came at 10 and sat on the edge of the bed and cried enough for both of them. By noon, the household knew that the dowager had gone. Nothing had been said aloud. There was no announcement. Mrs. Farthing, informed at 8 in the pantry passage by Pembridge in one flat sentence, had bowed her grey head and gone about ordering the fires. The Comtesse de Villeroi discovered it by way of an empty seat at breakfast and a distinct chill in the yellow drawing-room, where Cecily now stood at the window without turning to greet her. At 12:30, Mr. Pembridge appeared in the yellow drawing-room and, with a bow of no more than half an inch, informed Madame la Comtesse that His Grace regretted the sudden alteration of the household, and that a carriage would be at her disposal at 3 o'clock to convey her to the Blue Boar at Bury, from which the London stage departed at 7 of the morning. Leonie's small red mouth opened. She spoke rapidly in French, then, catching herself, in English, then again in French. Pembridge stood as though carved. "His Grace," he repeated, "regrets the sudden alteration of the household." She left at 3. She left in the plain traveling coach with the plain harness. The brass warming pan she had complained of was placed inside without ceremony. She would be in Paris before Lent. Peregrine did not appear before the household all day. He spent the morning with Boscawen in the writing closet on the ground floor. He spent the afternoon on horseback with his steward and the head keeper along the north boundary, ostensibly on the subject of a broken hurdle, in fact, so that any tenant who wished might see him unaccompanied and speak plainly. 2 of them did. He was back in the library at 7, alone. At 9, when the house had settled to the low creak of frost, he sent word by Pembridge. Not a summons, a request. Miss Selby was asked, at her convenience, to attend His Grace in the library for the space of a quarter of an hour. Judith came down still in the walnut brown. The cameo was not at her throat. The wire lay in a scrap of paper in the top drawer of her dressing table upstairs. He was standing when she entered, not at his desk, but at the panel to the left of the mantel. He turned. He did not sit, neither did she. "Your sister sleeps?" "She sleeps. Halloway will remain in the house through the new year." "Thank you." There was a small pause. It was not, this time, the silence of a corridor. It was the silence of 2 people who were about to speak to one another as themselves for the first time in 7 years, and neither wished to spoil it by hurrying. He said, "I would have you keep the name until 12th night, as we agreed." "I will. After that," he said, "you may put it down, or you may keep it. I will keep whichever you keep." She looked at him. His hand had come to rest, without his knowing, against the molding of the panel behind him. She had seen it do that once in the map closet, over a folio he did not open. "Your Grace," she said, and stopped, because there was no other word she had ever used to him, and she was not certain she wished to use it now. He said, very quietly, "Peregrine, when we are 2. She curtsied. It was, again, a fraction deeper and slower than a governess ought. He did not sit until she had gone out. Christmas passed. New Year passed. The house did not entertain. The stable was quiet. The children rode out with their uncle every fair morning. Marianne, by the 3rd of January, was in a chair by the schoolroom fire with the tabby kitchen cat, who was rechristened Bramble and never called anything else again, upon her knees. By the 3rd of January also, Mr. Boscawen had ridden twice to Bury and once to Cambridge and returned. The counterpart contract of 1811 lay upon the library table, a written expertise of 2 masters of the Bury Corporation of Writing Masters, comparing the hand of the March 1811 renunciation with the hand of Judith Aylmer at 15 and the hand of Constance Heathcote at 52, lay beside it. A quiet letter of consent from Sir Marcus Anstey, Magistrate, primo of the dowager to 3 removes, lay beside those. The Bishop of Bury had returned his own note, sealed in violet wax, expressing satisfaction that no scandal need reach the ordinary courts if the family consistory did its office. 12th night was fixed for the 6th of January. On the morning of the 6th, in the small dining room, at 10 of the clock, the consistory met. Peregrine, Duke of Thornbury, sat at the head. To his right, Sir Marcus Anstey. To his left, Lord Wendover, Cecily's brother, come down from London the night before. Boscawen at a small side table with his portfolio. Pembridge at the door. No women in the room save one, Judith Aylmer, who was called by that name for the first time in 7 years by a servant of the house, when Pembridge opened the door for her and said, "Quite level, Miss Aylmer, your grace." She wore the walnut brown. She had decided that. The mazarine blue was folded still in the trunk upstairs. She would not go into that room in silk. Silk was for the evening. She stood while the papers were read. She sat when Peregrine indicated the chair at his right hand. She did not speak, save once, to say, "That is my hand at 15. This other is not." Sir Marcus Anstey asked her, formally, whether she would consent that the matter be closed without recourse to the assizes, on the terms proposed. She said she would. Lord Wendover asked her, more gently, whether she required any private undertaking beyond what Boscawen had drawn. She said she did not. Boscawen then read aloud, in his dry professional voice, the terms. Constance Heathcote, Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, was, by act of the family consistory, and with the concurrence of 2 peers of the realm, formally set aside from all authority within the house of Thornbury. She would remove herself, before Lady Day, to the dower house at Fenwick in Wiltshire. She would receive her jointure of £800 per annum, no more and no less. She would have no rights, standing, nor voice in the education, marriage, guardianship, or succession of Henry and Louisa Heathcote. She would not enter this house, nor any house of Thornbury, without written invitation of the Duke. She would not write to the children, save through the Duke's hand. Her name would remain upon the pew, out of decency. Her seat in it would remain empty. The estate of Aylmer of Bedfordshire, unjustly extinguished in March of 1811, was restored, in name and in the entirety of its issues, to Judith Aylmer and to her sister Marianne Aylmer, with retroactive interest at 3% per annum, computed and paid from the private funds of His Grace the Duke of Thornbury, to be registered on the 16th instant at Chancery Lane. Mr. Oswin Boscawen was named perpetual man of business of the said Aylmer estate at a fee of £200 per annum. Mrs. Agatha Pettifer was named housekeeper of a small property at Kempston, in the interest of Miss Marianne Aylmer, at £50 per annum, and use of a servant, so that she should never again count coin in the dark. Madame Leonie de Villeroy, Comtesse, having quitted the country, was noted in the minutes only as no longer of any interest to the house of Thornbury. The papers were signed, the seals were pressed, Peregrine's signet, the acorn of Thornbury, came down upon the wax in a firm short movement of the left hand. Sir Marcus rose. He bowed to Judith as one bows in a drawing-room, not in an office. He said, "Miss Aylmer, I am glad to see justice done in a house I have known long." Lord Wendover said, "Your father was thought of, ma'am, in London, when it was still allowed to think of him. It will be so again." Peregrine said nothing at all. He was looking at the top paper on the table, at the place where his mother's forged hand was folded away beneath his own signature. Cecily was waiting in the corridor. She took Judith by the wrists and did not speak. That, too, was a thing to keep. The consistory was over by 11:30. The ball began at 9. By 7 the house had come alive again. It was a small ball, by Thornbury standards. 60 guests. Bury, Cambridge, 3 families from London. The Anstey carriage rolled in at 8:30. The Wendover carriage was already there. Snow was firm underfoot. Torches burned on either side of the north portico. The great hall was lit end to end with wax. Upstairs, in the 3rd-floor west room, Prim laced Judith into the mazarine blue. The heavy silk fell in one dark rush from shoulder to hem. Over it, the tulle overskirt, thin as breath, held its silver embroidery in a hush of light. Judith stood very still, while Prim fastened the small squared bodice and drew up the short puffed sleeves. Long kid gloves went on, ivory to above the elbow. Her dark hair was drawn high, plainer than fashion demanded, and threaded once with pearls of Cecily's giving. At her throat, on a fine new gold chain, the cameo of mother of pearl. The pearl was gone. In its place, filling the setting exactly, a small oval of chased gold, engraved on the reverse EA. It had been done in Barry by a man Boscawen knew, in 3 days, without discussion. Judith touched it once, and let it be. She came out of the west corridor at 10 minutes past 9. Cecily walked with her to the top of the great staircase, and there, in a movement half of pride and half of proper form, fell back a step, so that Judith might go down alone. Below, the hall was full. The music was already playing. Peregrine was at the foot of the stairs. He wore court black, the coat lined in blue that no one saw but himself, the silver brocade waistcoat, the white cravat, the ribbon of his order across the breast. His hair was brushed back. The scar upon his jaw showed pale against the sudden color of his face when he looked up and saw her. He did not move for the space of 2 beats of the music. Then he moved. He came up 3 steps to meet her. 3, and no more, because the rest of the house was watching, and he was still a duke, and dukes do not run up their own stairs. He offered his hand at the last stair. She laid her gloved fingers upon it. At the mahogany table by the door stood the visitor's book. It was Pembridge's affair. He had opened it, as he always did, at the page of the day, and set the pen ready in the standish. Guests were signing as they came. Peregrine led her to the table. Miss Aylmer, in a fair open hand, without ornament and without curve, wrote her true name in the book for the first time in 7 years. Judith Aylmer. She set the pen down. There was a small hush. It had been noticed, without a word being said, that she had not written Selby. Peregrine took up the pen. Beside her name, in the same firm, short movement of the left hand, he wrote 1 line only. You will not need to write again under a false name. He did not blot it. He set the pen down. He offered his arm. They went into the ballroom together. The music was a waltz. It had not been a waltz 5 years before in that room. The dowager had forbidden it. Peregrine had ordered a waltz to open. The floor cleared for them without instruction. He set his gloved hand at her waist. She set her gloved hand upon his shoulder. He said, low, so that only she heard it, I owe you 6 years, 1 month, and 22 days. She said, you owe me nothing. He said, I owe you every day of them, and I will pay in the only coin I have. She said, then I accept the coin. They danced. Around the walls, Boscawen watched with an expression not quite professional. Sir Marcus watched with the small, satisfied nod of a magistrate who had seen a hard piece of business properly closed. Lord Wendover watched with the ease of a man who had already told his sister everything he thought. Cecily watched openly, read with pleasure, and did not trouble to hide the tears in her eyes. Above, in the small drawing-room off the gallery, Marianne Aylmer, in a white muslin gown with a pale blue sash Cecily had insisted upon, sat upright in a chair by the fire, with the tabby cat asleep upon her lap and Mrs. Pettifer on a footstool beside her. Marianne could not yet come down, but she had been carried, wrapped in a fur, to the head of the gallery earlier in the evening to see her sister at the foot of the stairs, and she had said only, quite composedly, she looks like Mamma. Mrs. Pettifer, whose failing eyes had not troubled to see much of the ball, had heard the music and heard the hush, and understood without seeing. He turned her under the chandeliers. The silver on the tulle caught and let go and caught again. She held his gaze because there was nowhere else, in that room, that gaze wished to be. He asked, at one turn, do you remember the barn floor at Aylmer? She said, I have not remembered anything else in 7 years. He said, nor I. The music slowed. His hand at her waist did not shift. At the far end of the hall, an old cousin of the Ansteys, who had known Judith's father, laid her closed fan across her mouth and murmured to her neighbor that the Aylmer girl had her mother's carriage exactly. The neighbor, who had once refused to receive Judith's mother, did not answer. The waltz ended. Peregrine bowed. Judith curtsied. The ballroom applauded, decently, as a ballroom must when its host has opened a set. A second set was called. He did not lead her out for it. He led her, instead, to the alcove beside the mantel, and no one, in that room, mistook the meaning. The tall casement gave upon the frozen garden. The drawn curtain half hid them from the room. He kept her hand. There, From the inner breast of his coat, he took a folded paper. Not the counterpart contract, not the writing master's expertise. A smaller thing, older, the folds yellowed at their edges, opened and closed 1,000 times in 7 years. He put it into her gloved hand. She unfolded it. She had known which paper it would be before he had taken it out. It was the note of one line he had written her at the Aylmer harvest, when he was 23 and she was 15, and neither of them had yet had a name given to them by the world that fit. His hand at 23 was more slanted than his hand at 31. The T was the same T. She read it. She had not seen the words for 7 years, but she had never forgotten them. You were the only one who ever truly saw me. She folded it again along its old folds. She did not give it back. She said, "You kept this." He said, "I kept it in the panel to the left of the mantel of the library, under a paper I believed for 7 years I could not open. When I could open the paper above at last, this one was still beneath. I have brought it up to you." She said, "I kept the one you wrote at the same hour, in a book of prayers in Bedford." He said, "Then we have both kept what needed keeping." She looked up at him. She said very quietly, "You may ask me now." He did not kneel. It was not that kind of room. He bent his head so that his forehead almost, but not quite, touched hers, and he said, "Judith Aylmer, will you have the name of this house upon you? And will you let me have the name of yours upon me? And will you never again write yourself down in any book, in any hall, in any hand, under any name that is not the name you were born to?" She said, "I will." That was all. He straightened. He offered his arm. They went back into the ballroom and did not, for the rest of that night, dance again with anyone else, because they did not need to. The next morning, at 10:30, in a plain traveling carriage with a plain harness, the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, dressed in silk of half-mourning and a pelisse of grey, was set down at the gate of the Dower House at Fenwick in Wiltshire. She would live 22 more years there. She would be visited twice in that time by her son, once upon the birth of his first child, and once upon her deathbed, and she would speak on neither occasion of what had passed. Her name would remain upon the pew at Thornbury. Her seat in it would remain empty. Madame Léonie de Villeroi, having reached Paris by way of Calais in the last week of January, married in the spring a small vicomte of expired fortunes, and was not, at any subsequent point, invited into an English house. Sir Marcus Anstey rode home to his wife in Bury and said, at his own dining table, that he had seen a hard piece of business properly closed, and that it was a rare thing. Mr. Oswin Boscawen took the counterpart contract, the expertise, and the copy of the family minute back to Lincoln's Inn, filed them in the innermost drawer of his innermost cabinet, and thereafter drew, every quarter, at a fee of £200 per annum, upon a house he served, at last, with pleasure. Mrs. Agatha Pettifer went to Kempston in the second week of January, into a small brick house with a rose upon the south wall, and never counted the last coin in a tin box again. Marianne Aylmer grew up. She grew up at Thornbury. She kept the cat. Judith Aylmer, in the spring of 1818, was married to Peregrine Heathcote, Duke of Thornbury, in the chapel at Bury, by the bishop himself, in a plain gown of ivory silk, with the mother-of-pearl cameo at her throat, set in its small oval of chased gold, engraved E.A. upon the reverse. The bridegroom did not, at any moment during the ceremony, take his eyes from her. The house in Bedford, No. 4 Cardington Row, was quitted in February. The last thing Mrs. Pettifer packed from the room where the child had coughed was a small book of prayers, and inside it, still folded along its original folds, the single line the Marquis of Kelsey had written at the Aylmer harvest to a girl of 15. That paper, in time, was folded together with the paper that had been drawn from the panel in the library at Thornbury, and both were placed, in a single small casket of walnut, upon the desk of the Duchess of Thornbury, where they remained for the rest of her life. She never opened the casket without company. It was not, she found, a thing to open alone. But she had, at last, no more need to write down any name that was not her own. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever had to sign your life with a false name just to be allowed through the door? Have you ever carried, like Judith with her small mother-of-pearl cameo, one quiet object that held all the dignity the world tried to take from you? And if a man like the Duke of Thornbury walked past you today, Would he recognize the handwriting of who you truly are? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel